Hello, friend. However your day went, however tired you might be right now, I'm glad you found your way here tonight. Get comfortable. Maybe pull a blanket over your legs if you have one close by, because tonight we're about to spend some time in a world where a blanket was not just comfort, it was survival. Picture a woman alone in a small dark room in London. It is 1895. Outside, the coldest winter England has felt in decades is pressing against her window, so hard that ice has crept in onto the wallpaper itself. She has no husband, no father, no brother close enough to help her. Only her own two hands, a fire that already died hours ago, and a long stretch of darkness left before sunrise. Tonight we find out exactly how women like her stayed alive. Now, before we step into her world together, if you find yourself coming back to stories like this one night after night, tapping that like button and hitting subscribe helps this little story find its way to more people who might need it too. And honestly, I would love to know where you're watching from tonight and what time it is on your side of the world. Drop it in the comments. I look through every single one. If you already did all of that, thank you. It means more than you know. Alright, go ahead and dim the lights if you can. Maybe let a soft fan hum somewhere in the room, just enough sound to make the quiet feel a little less empty. Pull that blanket up a little higher, get warm, get settled, because tonight we are travelling back more than a century into a season that most history books rush right past, and into the lives of women whose names were rarely written down anywhere at all. London, the winter of 1895. Before the sun rises, before the milk cart rattles down the street outside, a young woman opens her eyes in the dark. She does not move right away. She lies still for a moment, listening to a silence so complete, it feels like the whole city has frozen along with the puddles outside her door. And then she sees it. Her own breath rising above her in the dark like smoke from a fire that no longer exists. Sometime near midnight, her small coal fire burned itself down to nothing. Nobody came to feed it while she slept. In her situation, nobody was going to. She sits up slowly. The blanket slides off her shoulder and the cold air meets her skin like a hand pressed flat against her chest. On the inside of her window, frost has crept across the glass overnight, curling into delicate little patterns that almost look pretty if you forget even for a moment what they actually mean. They mean the air inside her own bedroom grew cold enough to freeze water on the wrong side of the glass. Let's call her Eliza. She's not one single woman pulled from a history book. She could have been almost any of them. Because that same freezing morning all across London, thousands of women were opening their eyes to that exact same silence. Some were servants, already dressed, already halfway down a cold staircase, arms full of coal, meant for someone else's fire long before their own hands got the chance to warm. Some were widows sitting up in beds built for two people, quietly doing arithmetic in their heads, about how many lumps of coal remained in the cellar, and how many weeks of winter still stood between them and spring, and some had no bedroom at all that night. No door to close against the cold, only a doorway or a park bench, or in more than one recorded case, the hollow trunk of an old dying tree with a borrowed shawl pulled tight across the opening to keep the worst of the cold air out. Though history rarely says it out loud, a striking number of Victorian women were navigating this world without a husband to lean on at all. Some never married, some outlived their husbands by decades, some simply chose quietly and deliberately to stand on their own. And every single one of them had to face the same freezing bedroom, the same dead fireplace, the same 20 silent minutes, without a second pair of hands to share the work. We're going to meet several of these women properly a little later tonight. But first I want you to sit with Eliza for just a moment, because a small ordinary morning tells you almost everything you need to know about what this particular winter demanded from a woman with no man in the house to lean on. Listen closely and you can almost hear the city waking up around her. Somewhere below her window, a horse pulling an early cart lets out a long breath that turns to fog in the air. Ice groans faintly under a cartwheel on the cobblestones. Far off, a church bell marks the hour it sounds strangely sharp and clear, the way sound only travels on the coldest mornings. None of it is loud. All of it is cold. Eliza swings her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet meet a floor so cold it nearly burns, and here is the part modern life rarely prepares anyone for. In 1895, a floor like that was not just uncomfortable, it was a real hazard. Doctors of the era already understood, even without our modern words for it, that cold feet and cold hands led to broken skin, painful sores, sometimes infection. They called the condition chilblains, and for a woman living alone in winter, it was almost an occupational hazard simply for existing. Eliza reaches for her shawl before she reaches for anything else. Not her comb, not her shoes, her shawl. Because in a house with nobody to warm it for her, the first 10 minutes after waking were quite honestly the coldest and most dangerous minutes of her entire day. You're probably sitting somewhere warm right now, maybe under a blanket, maybe with a thermostat quietly doing all the work Eliza's own body had to do alone every single morning without complaint. And if you happen to be the kind of person who grumbles when the house drops to 68 degrees, Eliza would have happily traded you her best wool coat for that particular problem. But here is what actually makes her morning worth telling you about. She does not sit there feeling sorry for herself. She gets up. She dresses in layer after layer the way women had been dressing for generations before anyone had heard of central heating. A wool chemise first soft and worn thin from years of washing, then a flannel petticoat over that patched more than once at the hem. Stockings pulled up past the knee and tied with a strip of ribbon, because losing even a little warmth at the ankles could ruin an entire morning. By the time she is finally dressed, she's wearing nearly 6 separate layers of cloth, and not one single piece of it was meant to look pretty. Every piece of it was meant to keep her alive. A shawl goes over her shoulders, last of all pinned tight at the front, because a draft finding its way through even one loose seam could undo an hour of careful dressing in a matter of minutes. None of this happens quickly, and none of it happens easily. Fingers stiff with cold do not tie ribbons well. Buttons meant for warm, steady hands slip and resist. And yet Eliza moves through the whole routine without complaint, the way someone moves through a task they've repeated so many times it has become almost automatic, a quiet, private choreography of survival that nobody else in the house will ever see because there is nobody else in the house at all. Only then does she kneel in front of the small dead fireplace despite the freezing floor beneath her knees and begin carefully, with fingers already stiff from the cold, to build a brand new fire out of yesterday's ash. She rakes through the cold grey ash first, searching for any stubborn ember that might have survived the night. She finds none, so she starts from nothing. A little dry kindling, some twisted paper, a scrape of flint against steel again and again and again, until a single spark finally catches on something dry enough to hold it. She leans in close, cupping her hands around a flame barely bigger than a candle, breathing on it so gently it barely stirs the air, because breathe on it too hard, and it dies before it ever truly begins. It takes her nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes of patient, careful work that most of us today will never once have to think about, because we simply flip a switch and warmth arrives on command. For Eliza, and for countless women exactly like her, those 20 minutes quietly decided whether the rest of the day would be survivable or not. And that really is the question we're chasing tonight. Not just how cold Victorian winters could actually get, though we will get to that. Not just what women wore or how the wealthy managed to escape the worst of it, while the poor could not, though we will spend plenty of time there too. The real question sits somewhere simpler and somehow much harder to answer. What did it truly take physically, financially, emotionally, for a woman with no husband, no father, and no son to lean on to make it all the way through a single Victorian winter alive? Because here is the truth most period dramas never show you. Forget the roaring fireplaces and thick velvet curtains you've seen in films. For a woman like Eliza, survival rarely looked elegant. It looked like cracked hands. It looked like counting coal by the piece. It looked like 20 quiet minutes spent kneeling on a frozen floor, refusing to give up on a single spark. Eliza did make it through that morning. Her fire caught at last. Warmth slowly, unevenly began to creep back into the small quiet room around her, and for the first time since she opened her eyes, her shoulders finally dropped just slightly, the way anyone's do when a small hard-won battle has just been won. She holds her hands out toward the flame, close enough to feel it, not so close that it hurts, and for a minute or two she simply sits there in silence, letting warmth return to fingers that had gone almost numb. It is such a small moment. Nobody would think to write it down. And yet for Eliza, that quiet minute by the fire was the closest thing to comfort she was going to get before stepping out into whatever the rest of this particular winter had planned for her. She stands finally and walks to the window. Outside, London is turning pale grey with the first hint of morning, and the street below looks almost unrecognisable, coated in a hard, glassy frost that will not soften until well past noon. Somewhere out there in a few hours, Eliza will have to step into that frozen street herself, because the coal in her cellar will not last the week on its own, and neither will the few coins left in her tin box on the shelf. Staying warm was never just about surviving one morning. It was a calculation she had to make again and again every single day for months at a time. History rarely writes down mornings like this one. It remembers kings, wars, inventions, the grand and the dramatic. It almost never pauses for a woman alone kneeling by a dying fire, simply trying to make it breakfast. And yet mornings exactly like hers happened by the thousands, winter after winter for generations, largely unnoticed and almost entirely unrecorded. Tonight we're going to notice them. Before this story ends, you will meet the maids who carried other people's warmth up cold stone staircases every single morning of their working lives. You'll meet the widows who had to choose some winters between coal and bread. You will hear what actually happened to thousands of women because of the very fashion they wore to look proper in public, and you will step quite literally inside the single, coldest winter England had experienced in living memory, the very winter Eliza is living through right now. But to understand exactly what Eliza survived, we have to step back much further than her bedroom door. We have to understand what kind of winter this truly was. Because 1895 was not simply cold. It was one of the harshest winters England had felt in longer than almost anyone alive at the time could remember, and understanding exactly how brutal it really became is where our story has to begin. To answer that question honestly, we need to step outside Eliza's little room for a moment, past her frozen window, out into the streets of London itself, because what was happening out there that winter is almost impossible to picture unless you actually lived through it. Here is the part most people get wrong. We tend to imagine Victorian winters the way they appear on old holiday cards. Soft snow, gentle candlelight glowing behind frosted glass, carolers singing outside a warmly lit doorway. It looks cosy. It looks almost inviting, and it could not be further from what women like Eliza were actually facing that particular year. Because the winter stretching from 1894 into 1895 was not just one unlucky cold snap. It was the final brutal note in nearly a full decade of savage winters a stretch of years so consistently harsh that weather historians studying England's official temperature records that reach back more than 300 years, still point to this exact period as one of the coldest sustained stretches the country had ever measured. For close to 300 years before that, in fact, much of Europe had been living through what we now call a little ice age, a long, slow drift toward colder than average winters that lasted for generations. Nobody alive at the time used that phrase, of course. To them it was not a climate event with a name. It was simply winter, the only kind of winter they, their mothers and their grandmothers before them had ever known. And the final bitter chapter of that long cold age landed squarely on top of Eliza's own generation, right as it was finally slowly beginning to loosen its grip on the rest of the world. We know all of this today, largely because the English kept unusually careful weather records going back further than almost anywhere else on Earth. Clergymen jotted down daily temperatures in the margins of their parish books. Gentlemen scientists recorded readings from thermometers mounted outside their studies year after year, decade after decade, without ever imagining that someone more than a century later would piece their careful notes together into one long, unbroken timeline. Thanks to that quiet, patient habit, we can look back today and say with real confidence, not guesswork, exactly how brutal this particular stretch of winters truly was. And it was not only England that suffered. That same bitter cold reached across the entire North Atlantic that year, gripping much of continental Europe and stretching all the way to North America as well. If your own family history includes anyone who lived through a harsh winter in the northeastern United States, or across rural Canada, around that same period there is a real chance they were shivering through this very same weather system on the opposite side of the same ocean at almost exactly the same time Eliza was kneeling in front of her own dying fire. So let's talk about actual numbers, because I think numbers make this real, in a way that vague words like cold and freezing simply cannot. That February temperatures across England averaged well below freezing for the entire month, making it the second coldest February ever measured since official records began. In some parts of the country, the mercury dropped as low as 5 degrees Fahrenheit, not 5 degrees below freezing, 5 degrees full stop on a thermometer. Most of us would associate with the inside of a freezer, not the outside air a person had to walk through just to reach the market. If you have ever lived through a hard winter morning somewhere like Minnesota or upstate New York, the kind of cold that makes your nose hair freeze the moment you step outside, that is roughly the temperature we're talking about, except Eliza had no heated car waiting nearby and no warm building only a few steps away. The frost that winter did not stay politely on the surface either. It pushed down into the ground itself deep enough to crack water pipes and gas pipes buried well below the frost line, the kind of pipes nobody expected the cold to ever reach. One entire town in the middle of England lost its gas supply, completely plunged into darkness for days, simply because the pipes feeding it could not survive what the ground was doing to them. Imagine that for a moment, an entire town's lamps going dark, not because of war, not because of some grand disaster, but because the earth itself had frozen too deep for anyone to prevent it. Roads buckled where the frost heaved beneath them. Railway lines, the very veins of Victorian life, became impassable, in places stranding travellers, halting deliveries of coal and food to towns that badly needed both. Farmers could not move milk, merchants could not move flour, and in households already counting every last coin, a delayed coal delivery was never simply an inconvenience. It was a genuine crisis arriving at the worst possible moment. Ordinary small details from that winter tell the story almost better than any official record could. Laundry hung out to dry froze completely solid within minutes, stiff enough to stand nearly upright on its own, before anyone managed to bring it back inside. Ink froze in bottles on writing desks useless until it thawed near a fire. Milk left too long on a doorstep would freeze and push itself right up out of the bottle in a strange little column, a small, almost comic detail that hid a truly dangerous fact underneath it. Because if milk could freeze solid sitting on a doorstep, a person's hands and feet were never far behind it, and somewhere underneath all of that suffering sat a strange, almost eerie detail worth pausing on for a moment. The Thames itself, the great river this entire city had quite literally been built around, for close to 2,000 years grew a skin of ice, thick enough in places to bear real weight. We're going to come back to exactly what that frozen river meant a little later tonight, because for women with empty coal cellars and no husband to bring home wages, it changed everything. But I wanted you to know right now that it happened at all, because a river freezing solid enough to walk on is not scenery. It is a warning. Now, if you're thinking 1895 must have simply been a strange, unlucky exception, I want to gently push back on that because the truth is almost more unsettling. This particular winter was not an outlier at all. It was closer to the rule. Newspapers at the time struggled to describe it in ordinary language. Reporters reached for words like Arctic and merciless words, normally reserved for expeditions to the far ends of the earth, not for describing conditions in an English market town. That choice of language alone tells you something important. These were not writers exaggerating for effect. They were people watching their own familiar streets turn into something they barely recognized, and reaching for the only vocabulary that felt honest enough to describe it. Go back further into the 1830s and you find a January so cold it produced the lowest London temperature recorded during the entire 19th century. Rivers that rarely froze solid did that year. Livestock died standing in fields caught by cold that arrived faster than farmers could move their animals to shelter. The very next January after that brought what people at the time nicknamed the Night of the Big Wind, a storm so violent that snow from it did not fully melt until the middle of May, months later, long after most families expected to be planting rather than shoveling. A decade later, in what came to be remembered afterward as the Hungry 40s, a brutal snowstorm buried southern England just as an economic depression was already tightening its grip on the poorest households. Picture that combination for a moment. No coal money and no crops either arriving in the exact same season. It is difficult to imagine a crueler kind of timing. Move forward again into the 1870s and you find two more devastating snowy winters, back to back, close enough together that some families barely had time to recover from one before the next arrived at their door. Scotland further north generally had it worse still. Winters there routinely dropped colder than anything London ever recorded, and rural households scattered far apart across open countryside often had no neighbour close enough to call on when supplies ran short. A woman alone in a remote Scottish cottage was not simply cold. She could be entirely cut off, snowed in for days at a time, with nobody even aware she needed help until the thaw finally came. So when we talk about Eliza and about the countless women exactly like her, we're not talking about one unlucky season. We're talking about an entire generation of women who grew up, married, raised children, and in far too many cases buried husbands, all while winter itself seemed determined to test them again and again and again. Let me ask you something. Honestly, because I am curious. Have you ever spent even one night in a house with no heat at all, maybe during a storm, maybe during a power outage, and noticed how strange the silence gets when the cold settles in around you? That heavy waiting kind of quiet, if you have hold on to that feeling for a moment. Now imagine that night was not an unlucky exception at all. Imagine it was simply Tuesday, and Wednesday, and every night after that for months. because that is truly the part modern comfort makes almost impossible for us to feel in our bones. We assume cold is uncomfortable. History tells us quite plainly that cold was often lethal. There is another layer to this that rarely gets mentioned, and I think it deserves a moment of its own. Cold did not treat men and women quite equally in Victorian England, not because the temperature outside cared about anyone's gender, but because daily life itself was arranged so differently along those lines. Many men spent their days doing physically demanding work that, however brutal, at least generated its own warmth. Digging, hauling, walking long distances, working near forges or factory machinery. Women, especially women managing a household alone, often spent far more of their day sitting still, sewing by a window for the light, minding a shop counter, nursing a sick child through the night without daring to leave the room and let the fire beside them burn down. Stillness in a cold house is its own quiet danger, and it fell disproportionately on women simply because of how their daily lives were structured. Modern researchers studying cold housing today have found something worth sitting with, because I think it explains exactly what these women were up against, even though nobody in 1895 had the science to name it properly. When indoor temperatures drop much below 65 degrees, the human body responds by tightening blood vessels and raising blood pressure, placing real strain directly on the heart. Respiratory illness climbs as well, since cold air alone is enough to irritate already vulnerable lungs. Public health researchers even have a name for the pattern that results from all of this, something they call excess winter deaths, a measurable spike in mortality every single year, the moment the cold weather arrives, hitting hardest in homes that cannot be properly heated. That pattern did not begin in our lifetime. It has almost certainly been quietly repeating itself in England for centuries. Eliza's winter included long before anyone thought to measure it, or give it a name at all. And here is where I want to offer you my honest opinion for whatever it is worth. I think we do these women a real disservice when we imagine their winters as merely quaint or old-fashioned or somehow charming simply because they happened a long time ago in pretty dresses. There was nothing charming about a February cold enough to crack iron pipes underground. There was nothing quaint about doing arithmetic every single morning to figure out whether you had enough fuel to survive the week. What these women lived through deserves to be remembered as exactly what it was, not a picturesque backdrop. A genuine fight for survival fought quietly without headlines by women whose names mostly never made it into any history book at all. If you have ever seen the news completely lose its composure over a single snow day closing schools, emptying grocery store shelves, sending reporters out to stand dramatically in front of a light dusting of snow, try just for a moment to imagine what an entire newsroom from that era would have made of a decade like this one. I suspect they would have run out of dramatic words entirely by the second winter, and maybe that comparison is exactly the point worth sitting with for a moment. We panic today over weather that Eliza's generation would have considered honestly a fairly gentle Tuesday, not because they were tougher than us in some vague mythical way people love to claim about the past. They simply had no other choice. There was no app to check, no warning to heed, no snow day to take. There was only the fire in front of you and whatever skill you'd managed to build for keeping it alive. But knowing exactly how cold it was outside only tells you half of this story, and honestly it might be the easier half to understand. Because outside at least everyone expected the cold. Everyone dressed for it, braced for it, complained about it together. The far more dangerous cold was the kind that followed women home, slipped in through gaps around windows, crept up through floorboards, and settled into rooms that were supposed to be safe. That is where we need to go next, inside the Victorian home itself. Because a house, as it turns out, was never quite the shelter people assumed it to be. Walls that looked solid from the street could still let winter walk right through them, and the single small fireplace that an entire household, or in Eliza's case, one woman entirely alone, was expected to survive an entire winter on had far more working against it than most of us would ever guess. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. A house back then was never really built to keep a person warm. It was built to keep the rain out, to keep a family sheltered from the worst of the weather, and to look respectable from the street. Warmth was something you had to create yourself fresh every single day, almost entirely by hand. Walk into an ordinary Victorian home and the first thing that would strike you honestly, before you even noticed the furniture or the wallpaper, is just how much of that house was quietly working against the people living inside it. Start with the walls. Most homes from this period were built from solid brick or solid stone, one thick layer, with nothing but old lime mortar holding it together, and absolutely nothing in between to slow the cold down. Modern homes trap a cushion of air inside their walls specifically to hold heat in. Victorian walls had no such cushion. Cold simply pressed straight through solid material the same way it would through a single sheet of stone left standing in a field. Then there were the windows. Nearly every window in a home like this held only one thin pane of glass set into a wooden frame that had usually swollen, shrunk and swollen again through so many seasons that it no longer sat perfectly flush. Even a well-built sash window of that era let a steady trickle of outside air seep in around its edges all day and all night, whether anyone wanted it there or not. And beneath people's very feet, the floor itself was often working against them too, in a way that still catches most people by surprise when they hear it for the first time. Victorian builders raised timber floorboards up on wooden joists, leaving a hollow, ventilated gap underneath the entire ground floor. They did this on purpose, and honestly it was rather clever engineering for its time, because that gap allowed air to circulate underneath the house and kept the wood from quietly rotting away from damp. But cleverness and comfort are not always the same thing. That same ventilated gap meant cold air was constantly moving directly beneath the floorboards a person stood on, sat on, and in Eliza's case knelt on every single morning to build her fire. The house was quite literally engineered to breathe cold air in from underneath, even while everyone inside was trying desperately to keep warm above it. Now add high ceilings into the mix, a feature Victorian architecture is still admired for today. All that graceful airy space overhead. It photographs beautifully. It also happens to be one of the worst possible design choices for anyone trying to stay warm, because heat rises reliably and completely straight up toward that lovely high ceiling, hovering somewhere well above the heads of the people actually shivering below it. So picture all of that working together at once. Cold pressing in steadily through solid walls. Cold air seeping through window frames that no longer quite closed. Cold drifting up from a ventilated void beneath the floor, and whatever warmth a fire did manage to produce drifting straight up out of reach toward a ceiling nobody could actually stand close enough to touch. A Victorian house was not simply cold by accident. It was cold by design in almost every direction at once, and nobody living inside it had the faintest idea how to fix that, because the very idea of insulation as we understand it today simply did not exist yet. Which brings us to the fire itself, the one thing every household actually did have some control over. And here is where the whole picture gets even more complicated, because an open coal fire, the kind glowing in almost every parlour across England that winter, was frankly a remarkably poor way to heat a room. Think about how an open fire actually works for a moment. Coal burns in a small grate set against one wall, and the heat it produces radiates outward in one direction, toward whoever happens to be sitting directly in front of it. Meanwhile, the smoke and along with it a truly large share of the heat that same fire just worked so hard to produce rises straight up the chimney and disappears into the sky above the rooftops, carried away on a draught the fire itself creates simply by burning. A person could sit close enough to a coal fire to feel their face growing almost uncomfortably hot, while their own back only a few feet further away stayed nearly as cold as the hallway outside the door. Turn slightly in your chair, and you could feel both extremes at once, roasting on one side and shivering on the other, which is precisely why so many portraits and photographs from the period show people angled oddly toward the hearth, practically leaning into it, chasing warmth that refused to spread any further than a few short feet in any direction. This is precisely why Victorian households, almost without exception, made a single unglamorous decision that shaped an entire winter. They heated one room. Just one. Usually the parlour, or in poorer homes the kitchen itself, since cooking, already required a fire burning there regardless. Every other room in the house, every bedroom, every hallway, every staircase landing was simply left to fend for itself against whatever temperature the outside world happened to be offering that day. Can I ask you something honestly? Think about your own home right now for just a second. How many rooms in it currently have any kind of heat reaching them at all? Now imagine cutting that number down to exactly one, and imagine that decision was not really a choice at all, but simple, unavoidable arithmetic, because heating anything more than that single room was completely out of reach financially for most ordinary families, and that arithmetic, it turns out, was remarkably harsh. Coal for an average working household, according to household budgets, recorded from the period, typically cost somewhere around 2 shillings a week during the colder months, spent almost entirely on fuel for that one single fire. That might sound like a modest amount until you realise it often represented a meaningful slice of an entire week's wages for a woman working alone once rent food, and every other basic necessity had already taken their share first. Here is the detail that truly stopped me when I first came across it, though, because it reveals something about poverty that honestly still applies today more than a century later. Wealthier households could afford to buy their coal by the ton in one large seasonal delivery at the lowest possible price per pound. Poorer households almost never had anywhere to store that much coal at once, no proper cellar, no spare shed, sometimes barely enough space for their own furniture. So instead, they were forced to buy coal in small amounts, a single hundredweight at a time, from local dealers who quite predictably charged considerably more per pound for the privilege of selling it that way. The poorest households in England were in effect paying a penalty simply for being too poor to buy in bulk. We have a name for that pattern today. We call it the poverty premium, the simple, maddening reality that being poor frequently costs more, not less, than being comfortable. It turns out that particular unfairness is nowhere near as modern an invention as most of us assume. For a woman entirely on her own, this arithmetic became even harder to manage because she was doing all of it completely alone. In a wealthier home, a servant or several existed specifically to keep that single fire fed, to haul coal up from the cellar, to rake out yesterday's ash before it had even properly cooled. A woman like Eliza had no such help waiting for her. She was all at once her own coal merchant, her own servant, and her own firekeeper, budgeting every single lump the same careful way she budgeted every coin in her purse, because running out of either one midwinter could mean genuine danger rather than mere discomfort. If she rented her room, which many women in her exact circumstances did, the arrangement often made things trickier still. Landladies renting out furnished rooms across London rarely included coal in the weekly rent at all. Fuel was almost always considered the tenant's own responsibility, purchased separately, carried up separately, and rationed separately, often by a woman who had absolutely nobody else in the building she could reasonably ask for help. Picture her making that same short, cold walk to the local coal merchant again and again throughout the season, a small sack or scuttle in hand, rather than a proper cart, because a proper cart and the discount that came with it belonged to households with somewhere to store what it delivered. Have you ever noticed how often being poor means paying for the exact same thing multiple times in smaller and smaller portions, simply because you cannot afford the comfort of buying it once? Eliza would have understood that feeling better than most of us ever will. Now picture the same winter playing out in a wealthier household nearby just a few streets away, and the contrast becomes almost uncomfortable to sit with. In a large townhouse, multiple fireplaces might be burning simultaneously, one in the drawing room, one in the study, one kept lit specifically to warm the water for an afternoon bath nobody in Eliza's position could ever have afforded to consider. And yet even there, in all that relative comfort, the bedrooms upstairs were often left just as cold as anywhere else in the city, because even wealthy Victorian households generally believed that a cold bedroom was somehow good for a person's constitution. Warmth in their thinking made people soft. Cold made people hardy. It is a rather convenient philosophy to hold, I've always thought, when you are the one with a roaring fire waiting for you downstairs the moment you actually want it. And underneath all of them, top to bottom, rich households and poor ones alike, sat the poorest housing of all the cramped single-room tenements crowded into the older, narrower streets of industrial cities, where an entire family might share exactly one small hearth for cooking, washing, warming water and heating the only room they had all at once around the clock every single day of the coldest months of the year. On the harshest nights, it was not unusual for that same family to abandon their proper beds entirely and simply sleep together on the floor closest to the fire, parents and children in one huddled pile, because the bedroom a few feet further away had in every practical sense become a separate, colder country of its own. So when we talk about a Victorian winter, we're not really describing one single experience shared equally by everyone who lived through it. We're describing dozens of different winters layered directly on top of each other within the very same city on the very same freezing night, depending entirely on how much coal a person could actually afford to buy and how many hands were available to help carry it. Faced with a house working against them in every possible direction, women of the era did what people facing an unbeatable problem have always done. They found small, clever ways to fight back anyway. Heavy curtains hung floor to ceiling, wherever a household could manage it, were never simply decoration. They were the closest thing Eliza's generation had to double, glazing a thick barrier of fabric drawn tightly shut the moment darkness fell, trapping whatever warmth remained in a room before it could escape through cold glass. Thick rugs covered bare, drafty floorboards for exactly the same reason, laid down not for comfort alone, but as a genuine, deliberate barrier against the cold air quietly moving underneath the house. In wealthier homes, entire tapestries sometimes hung across bare walls, an old habit inherited from centuries earlier, when insulation of any kind meant nothing more sophisticated than a heavy piece of woven cloth, nailed firmly to stone. Unused rooms, wherever a household had them, were simply sealed off entirely for the season. Doors stayed shut. Sometimes a rolled blanket or an old length of cloth was pressed against the gap beneath the door, stopping cold air from creeping out into the one hallway anyone actually needed to walk through. It was not an elegant solution. It was not even a particularly effective one most nights. But it represented something worth admiring. I think a kind of quiet, practical resourcefulness that turned a house actively working against its occupants into something at least survivable through sheer persistent effort alone. There is something else worth mentioning here too, something that quietly connects this whole story back to right now, to whichever room you happen to be sitting in this very moment. Fuel poverty. The simple, painful choice between staying warm and paying for absolutely everything else a household needs has never really disappeared. It has just changed its name a few times and swapped coal scuttles for electricity meters. The particular math Eliza was doing in her head that winter, weighing warmth against food, warmth against rent, is a calculation. Plenty of families are still quietly making today in houses with central heating systems Eliza could never have imagined waiting for a bill that suddenly feels far too high. It is in a strange way a little humbling. We like to believe progress solves problems completely once and for all. This particular one, it seems, just learned to wear a different coat, but there was one more danger hiding inside that single precious fire, something we have not touched on yet, and it had almost nothing to do with how much heat it actually produced or how expensive it was to keep burning. It had everything to do with what stood close enough to that fire to catch, because a Victorian woman did not simply sit near her fire for warmth, keeping a polite, careful distance the way we might today. She dressed for it, worked beside it, cooked directly over it, bent low to tend it, and reached across it constantly throughout her day, wearing clothing that more often than any of us would like to imagine turned that very same fire into one of the most quietly dangerous threats she faced all winter long. Not a threat from the cold this time, a threat from the warmth itself and from the very fabric she wrapped round her body to survive it. That particular danger has a body count attached to it, an almost unbelievable one, and it is exactly where our story needs to go next. Let's start with what she actually put on her body piece by piece, because there was far more to it than most of us realize, and every single layer had a job to do. Closest to the skin came a simple cotton or linen chemise, soft from repeated washing, meant less for warmth than for keeping everything worn over it clean and free from sweat. Over that went a corset lace snug, but rarely as brutally tight as popular imagination likes to suggest, since a woman who could not breathe properly could hardly manage a full day of physical work. The corset's real job in winter had almost nothing to do with fashion at all. It held several loose layers firmly against the body, stopping cold air from finding its way underneath, and sneaking around the same principle behind a snug base layer any hiker relies on today, just laced with cord instead of stitched from modern synthetic fabric. Then came the petticoats, and this is where winter dressing really became its own quiet discipline. A woman might wear 2, 3, sometimes 4 separate petticoats, stacked directly on top of each other, each one serving a slightly different purpose. A flannel petticoat sat closest for warmth, its rough wool weave trapping air against the legs the way a good blanket traps heat around a sleeping body. Over that, a quilted petticoat sometimes stuffed with wool batting, or even old scraps of fabric added a second thicker barrier. And finally, depending on the decade and the woman's means, a stiffened outer petticoat gave the whole arrangement its proper shape before the dress itself ever went on. Stockings came next, wool or cotton, depending on what a household could afford, pulled up past the knee and secured with a simple tied garter, because in a world with no elastic as we know it today, a stocking sliding down around the ankle by midday was a real constant, mildly infuriating problem. Layered stockings, 2 or even 3 pairs at once on the coldest days, were common enough that nobody thought twice about the slightly odd shape it gave a woman's legs beneath her skirts. And then finally the dress itself, usually wool, or a heavy wool blend for winter, with a high, close-fitting neckline and long sleeves that reached all the way to the wrist, because exposed skin in a Victorian winter was simply an invitation for trouble. Step outside and an entirely new layer of protection came into play. A heavy wool mantle or cloak went over the shoulders, sometimes lined with fur for anyone who could afford it. A bonnet tied firmly beneath the chin covered the head and ears, both because losing heat from an uncovered head was as real a concern then as it is for anyone standing at a cold bus stop today. On her feet, sturdy leather boots often lined with an extra layer of wool felt for the coldest months replaced the lighter shoes worn indoors, though even good boots offered only modest protection against snow that had a habit of finding its way in through the smallest seam. Gloves, usually wool or leather, covered the hands, though gloves alone often were not enough, which is exactly why the fur muff became such a beloved winter accessory across every class that could manage one. A muff was not simply decorative. It was a small portable pocket of warmth a woman carried in front of her at all times, hands tucked inside from both ends, and more than a few women, if they had the means, tucked a small hot water bottle inside their muff before leaving the house, turning a fashion accessory into a genuine functioning heat source she carried with her all day long. I find that particular detail rather wonderful, honestly. Long before anyone had heated gloves or battery-powered hand warmers, Victorian women had already worked out the exact same idea, just with hot water and good sewing instead of electricity. By the time she was fully dressed for a winter's day outdoors, a woman might be wearing somewhere close to 10 separate layers of cloth, each one doing real specific work. None of it was accidental. None of it was simply about looking proper, though it certainly did that too. It was quite literally a wearable survival system refined over generations by women who had no choice but to become experts in exactly how much fabric stood between their own body heat and a cold that could truly kill. Now here is where the story takes a sharper turn, because there was one particular piece of that system that deserves its own careful, honest telling. And I want to be upfront with you, this next part is not an easy one. Sometime around the middle of the 1800s, a new invention arrived that promised to solve an old exhausting problem. Wearing 4 or 5 separate petticoats every single day, as we just described, was heavy hot in the wrong places and remarkably tiring to move around in for hours at a time. So dressmakers introduced something called the crinoline, a cage-like structure built from thin steel hoops or flexible whalebone worn under a single skirt instead of underneath a whole stack of petticoats. It gave a woman the same fashionable wide bell-shaped silhouette everyone wanted, using a fraction of the weight and bulk. Women quite reasonably loved it. It let them move more freely, climb stairs without dragging pounds of fabric behind them, and stay lighter on their feet through the exact same cold months we've been discussing all along. But that clever cage came with a hidden flaw one nobody fully understood until it was already far too late for thousands of women. The fabric stretched over that steel frame, usually a light, airy cotton or muslin, was extremely flammable, and the cage itself, rather than protecting the wearer, acted almost like a chimney turned sideways. Once a spark caught the hem, the wide-open structure underneath fed it air from every direction, at once letting flames spread across an entire skirt in a matter of seconds, rather than slowly creeping the way fire moves through a single layer of cloth. Think back for a moment to everything we just spent an entire section discussing. Victorian women spent their winters kneeling in front of fireplaces, standing close to hearths, reaching across open flames to cook, to warm water, to simply feel their own hands again after a freezing morning. Now put a wide, cage-shaped skirt made of flammable fabric directly into that same daily routine for months on end, every single winter. The danger practically built itself. Historians who study this period still argue over the exact number, and I think that honesty matters more than a clean dramatic statistic. Some estimates drawn from newspaper reports and coroners' records of the time suggest that somewhere around 3,000 women died from crinoline-related fires across a roughly 10-year stretch in the 1850s and 1860s alone. Other historians believe that figure has been repeated so often It has grown a little inflated along the way any striking number tends to once enough people quote it, without checking the original source. Either way, even the more cautious estimates agree on one deeply uncomfortable point. This was not a handful of freak accidents. It was a genuine pattern common enough that one medical journal of the time openly worried about it in print, and common enough that a popular magazine, only half joking, suggested every fashionable woman ought to be accompanied by a servant carrying a bucket of water just in case. And this was never a danger limited to wealthy drawing rooms either, which I think surprises people the most when they first hear about it. Servants and working women adopted their own cheaper simplified versions of the crinoline, almost as quickly as their employers did, sewn from thinner steel or cane rather than proper whalebone, because looking presentable mattered enormously to a woman's employment prospects, and the fashion had quite simply become the new normal for anyone who wanted to be taken seriously in public. The very same women who spent their working days kneeling beside kitchen fires, exactly the task we spent our last section describing in such detail, were often the ones wearing the cheapest, most poorly made versions of the very garment most likely to catch. You might reasonably ask why women kept wearing something this dangerous at all once the pattern became obvious. It is a fair question, and I do not think the honest answer reflects poorly on them in the slightest. Fashion in Victorian England was never simply a matter of personal taste. A woman's clothing signalled her respectability, her class standing, her fitness for marriage or for employment, in a society that judged women constantly and often unforgivingly on appearance alone. Choosing not to wear a crinoline once it became the expected shape could mean looking noticeably out of step, old-fashioned, even faintly disreputable. Weighed against that kind of social risk and abstract danger that had so far happened to someone else in someone else's kitchen, was not always enough to change behaviour. That particular pattern, choosing the comfortable, familiar risk over the awkward, visible alternative, is not exactly foreign to any of us either, if we are honest with ourselves. Let me tell you about a few of these women because I think naming them matters. History remembers so few ordinary people by name, and these women deserve better than becoming a faceless statistic. A 14-year-old kitchen maid named Margaret Davy was standing on the fender of a fireplace one evening, reaching up toward the mantelpiece for a set of spoons, an entirely unremarkable everyday task, repeated in kitchens across the country every single day. Her crinoline brushed the flames below her. Within moments her dress had caught entirely. She did not survive her injuries, and the coroner at the inquest, visibly troubled, remarked that he was honestly astonished such a common deadly pattern had not drawn more serious public attention already. Later that same year, a 16-year-old girl named Emma Musson lost her life after a small piece of burning coke, likely no larger than a coin, touched the hem of her skirt while she stood near a kitchen fire. 16 years old, doing nothing more dangerous than standing in her own kitchen on an ordinary evening. And this particular danger did not stay confined to servants and working girls either. Fanny Longfellow, wife of the celebrated American poet Henry Wadsworth. Longfellow died from her injuries after her dress caught fire from an open flame in her own home, a private domestic tragedy that shocked readers on both sides of the Atlantic precisely because it proved wealth and status offered no real protection at all. Around the same period, two half-sisters connected to the writer Oscar Wilde's own family lost their lives after one sister's dress caught fire at an evening gathering, and the other, in a desperate, loving attempt to help, was fatally burned trying to save her. Can you see the pattern running through every single one of these stories? A kitchen maid reaching for spoons, a girl standing near her own hearth, a poet's wife at home with her family, sisters at a gathering meant to be joyful. None of them were being careless. None of them were doing anything a Victorian woman was not expected to do every single day all winter long. They were simply living their ordinary lives, dressed exactly the way society demanded, standing exactly where the season required them to stand close enough to a fire to survive the cold. Here is my honest opinion on all of this, for whatever it might be worth to you. We tend to talk about historical fashion as something separate from historical danger, as though the two lived in entirely different chapters. Corsets get discussed as a beauty topic. Crinolines get discussed as a style trend, something charming and old-fashioned to admire in a museum case behind glass. But for the women actually wearing them, fashion and survival were never separate questions at all. Every choice about what to put on her body was also whether she consciously thought about it or not. A choice about risk, about warmth, about how close she could safely stand to the one thing keeping her alive that winter. I want to ask you something, and I would love to hear your honest answer in the comments below. Do you think you would have recognized the danger if you had been standing in Liza's exact position, dressed exactly the way everyone around you was dressed, doing exactly what everyone around you considered perfectly normal? It is remarkably easy to judge the past from a warm, well-lit room a century and a half later. It is much harder to imagine truly not knowing, because nobody around you knew either. Eventually, by the early 1870s, fashion itself began to move on, as fashion always does, and the wide crinoline slowly gave way to narrower shapes, and eventually the bustle worn further back at the waist. But that shift happened slowly, and it happened for reasons of changing taste far more than any deliberate response to the fires that had already claimed so many lives. The underlying wearable survival system we started this entire conversation with, though the chemise, the layered petticoats, the wool stockings, the fur-lined muff with its secret hot water bottle, tucked inside, all of that quietly outlived the crinoline entirely, and kept doing its patient essential work for decades afterward. Because here is the truth sitting underneath this whole difficult chapter. Clothing was never simply about looking respectable in Victorian England. It was armour assembled one layer at a time against a cold season that never once showed any mercy. Sometimes that armour worked exactly as intended, keeping a woman warm through a bitter February morning much like the one Eliza was living through. And sometimes, heartbreakingly, the very fabric meant to protect her became the thing that failed her. Instead, a contradiction that still feels difficult to sit with, even from this safe distance of more than a century. But surviving the cold was never only about what a woman wore or how carefully she stood near her own fire. For an enormous number of women that winter, survival also depended entirely on other hands that were not their own, carrying coal up freezing staircases before the sun had even properly risen, tending fires in rooms they themselves were rarely permitted to warm themselves beside for long. And that is exactly whose story deserves to be told next. Let's talk about those other hands for a moment, because behind almost every warm parlour in Victorian England stood a woman whose own morning looked nothing like the comfort she was busy creating for someone else. Her name, let's say, was Alice. 15 years old, employed as a housemaid in a fairly ordinary middle-class household, the kind with perhaps 4 or 5 bedrooms, and a family who considered themselves quite respectable. Alice did not sleep in a proper bedroom at all. She slept in the attic, tucked under the roofline, where the ceiling sloped so low she could barely stand upright near the walls, in a space that stayed every bit as cold as the world outside, because whatever heat the house below managed to hold on to rarely made it all the way up there. She woke before 5 in the morning in near total darkness, and dressed as quickly as her stiff cold fingers allowed, because lingering under the blankets cost her time she truly could not spare. There was no fire in Alice's own room to dress, beside no gentle warmth to ease her out of sleep the way it might for the family 2 floors below her. She simply pulled on her uniform layer over layer, the same practiced motion Eliza herself performed each morning, except Alice's hands were already trembling slightly from cold before she had even reached the top of the servants' staircase. By the time most of the household she served was still deep asleep, Alice was already moving down the narrow back staircase reserved for servants careful and quiet, toward a kitchen that had gone cold overnight exactly the same way Eliza's own little room had, except this time the fire Alice was about to build was never meant to warm her. It was meant to warm everyone else first. She would not sit beside it once it caught. There was no time for that, and honestly it was not entirely her place to linger there either. Once the kitchen range was properly lit, she gathered her supplies, a small tin of matches kindling wood, already split the evening before a brush for the hearth, and began the long climb back upstairs to start on the family's rooms one by one while the house around her stayed almost entirely silent except for her own quiet footsteps. Here is something worth sitting with honestly before we go any further. We spent our last section imagining a woman building her own single fire alone for herself. Now imagine doing that same freezing 20-minute task and then doing it again, and again. In a house of any real size, a housemaid like Alice was not responsible for one fireplace. She was responsible for every single one the household owned, moving from room to room, before the family had even opened their eyes, coaxing a dozen separate flames to life across an entire house that by the time anyone else woke up would feel effortlessly warm and welcoming, as though it had simply always been that way. A household staff of any real size divided this enormous task carefully, almost like a small quiet army with its own strict chain of command. The housekeeper sat at the top of the female staff, overseeing everything, answering directly to the mistress of the house herself. Beneath her came the housemaids, Alice among them, responsible for the fires, the bedrooms and the general upkeep of the family's living space. Down in the kitchen, an entirely separate hierarchy operated a cook presiding over one or more kitchen maids, who handled the heaviest, dirtiest work of preparing food over an open flame that never truly went out. Below, even them in the very largest household, sat the scullery maid, often the youngest girl on staff, given the coldest, wettest jobs nobody else wanted, scrubbing pots in water that had usually gone cold long before she finished. Every single role in that quiet chain existed in one way or another to keep a fire burning somewhere in that house, for somebody else's comfort. In grander homes, the ones with proper drawing rooms, studies, morning rooms, and multiple family bedrooms, that number could climb considerably higher. A large country house might easily hold a dozen or more working fireplaces, and every single one needed to be cleared of yesterday's ash, laid fresh and lit, all before the household came down for breakfast, expecting a warm room waiting for them. Multiply Alice's 20 minutes by a dozen fireplaces, and you begin to understand why a housemaid's morning did not simply start early. It started in what most of us would still consider the middle of the night. There was a particular rule governing all of this labour that I think deserves its own moment, because it tells you something quite specific about how servants were meant to exist within a household. Alice was expected to work almost entirely without being noticed. Etiquette guides from the period actually instructed housemaids to complete their fire lighting and room cleaning before the family stirred, and if a member of the household happened to encounter a servant mid-task in a hallway, the servant was trained to step aside quietly, eyes lowered, and continue as though the meeting had never happened at all. Warmth, in other words, was meant to simply appear as if by magic, with the labour behind it kept as invisible as the woman performing it, and the fire lighting itself was only the beginning of it. Coal had to be carried scuttle by scuttle up narrow servant staircases that wound tightly between floors, a remarkably brutal task, when you consider that a full coal scuttle could weigh close to 20 pounds, carried by hand up and down the same stairs sometimes dozens of times across a single day. Ash had to be raked out from cold grates and carried back down again. Hearths had to be swept spotless, because a lady of the house judged a housemaid's competence largely on whether any trace of yesterday's fire remained visible by morning. It was dirty, physically punishing labour, performed almost entirely out of sight, precisely so the family upstairs never had to think about where their comfort actually came from. Can I ask you something? Think about the last time you complained about doing laundry or taking out the trash on a cold morning. Now imagine that same mild household chore repeated a dozen times before sunrise every single day for years by a girl barely old enough by our standards today to hold an after-school job. I will admit thinking about Alice's morning has permanently ruined my ability to complain about my own thermostat, taking a few extra minutes to warm up the room. It feels almost embarrassing now honestly standing in front of a wall panel, tapping a button waiting less than a minute for heat that Alice would have spent the better part of an hour earning with her own two hands. The physical toll of this work went far beyond simple tiredness too. Hauling heavy coal scuttles up steep stairs day after day left many servants with real lasting back trouble by the time they reached their 30s, an age we would now consider barely middle-aged. Hands cracked and blackened from handling coal and ash constantly came into contact with icy water during washing up, an unavoidable combination that left many young servants with skin so damaged by midwinter that simple tasks like buttoning a uniform became truly painful. And the coal dust itself breathed in daily across years of service in poorly ventilated kitchens and cellars almost certainly contributed to respiratory troubles that nobody at the time had any real way of tracing back to its actual cause. Now here is a detail I think deserves real attention, because it reveals something quietly devastating about where servants like Alice actually came from in the first place. A significant number of the young women working as maids across Victorian England had grown up at least partly inside the workhouse system itself, the very institution built to house the desperately poor. Workhouse girls were often trained specifically in domestic service from a remarkably young age, sometimes as young as 13, taught how to scrub, how to lay a fire, how to carry a scuttle correctly, and then placed directly into private households the moment they were considered old enough to earn their keep. Many of these girls had known nothing but institutional life before that first placement. No family home of their own to compare it to, no warm childhood memory to measure their new exhausting reality against. For them, service was not simply a job, it was quite literally the only version of adult life the world had ever offered them. Try to imagine that particular kind of beginning for a moment. A girl raised entirely within institutional walls, taught obedience and household skills in equal measure, then sent essentially as a stranger into someone else's private home to spend her waking hours keeping that family comfortable, all before she'd ever had the chance to experience an ordinary unstructured childhood of her own. There was no warm memory of a mother's kitchen for a girl like that to draw comfort from during a hard winter shift. There was only the work in front of her, and the quiet, practical knowledge that doing it well was the only security she had ever known, and the wages waiting at the end of all the labour were frankly modest at best. A young kitchen maid, the lowest ranking position in a household staff, might earn somewhere around £6 a year, a sum that sounds almost comically small today, though it is worth remembering that room and board were typically included, which mattered enormously to a girl with nowhere else to sleep. Even a more experienced housemaid rarely earned more than £10 or £12 annually, a figure that, once you account for how many hours actually filled her day, worked out to remarkably little per hour of remarkably difficult labour. Put another way, an entire year of Alice's frozen mornings, her cracked hands, her aching back might add up to less money than a single fashionable dress worn once to a dinner party by the very woman she served. Legal protection for servants during this period was, to put it gently, minimal. Employers held enormous power over a young woman's entire livelihood. A servant dismissed without warning had almost no meaningful recourse, no legal right to challenge the decision in any practical sense. And crucially, no guarantee her former employer would provide the character reference she would desperately need to find her next position. Losing a place midwinter, through no real fault of her own, could mean losing her only roof over her head at the exact moment she needed one most. A single accusation, fair or not, a single moment of illness that slowed her down, a single employer simply grown tired of her face, and Alice's entire winter could unravel in a single afternoon. There is a particular kind of loneliness built into this arrangement too, one that rarely makes it into how we picture the era. Servants living within a family's own home were in a strange way never quite alone and never quite accompanied either. Romantic relationships referred to at the time as followers were actively discouraged by most employers, viewed as an unwelcome distraction from a servant's duties. A young woman like Alice might spend an entire winter surrounded by a busy, warm, occupied household every single day, and still go to bed each night in that same cold attic room with barely another living soul to talk to, who understood her situation at all. Here is where I want to share my own honest perspective on all of this, because I think it matters. We tend to picture Victorian domestic comfort, the roaring fires, the polished silver, the warm parlour greeting a family each morning, as though it simply appeared on its own, some natural feature of a well-run household. It did not. That comfort was manufactured hour by hour by the aching hands and cracked knuckles of young women who were rarely thanked, rarely paid what their labour was actually worth, and almost never remembered by name once their service ended. When we admire a beautifully preserved Victorian drawing room today, warm firelight glowing across polished furniture, in an old photograph, I think it is worth remembering exactly whose freezing morning made that photograph possible in the first place. Nobody photographed Alice. Nobody ever thought to. History kept careful, loving records of the furniture in that drawing room, the pattern on the wallpaper, the maker of the clock on the mantelpiece, and almost nothing at all about the girl who kept the fire beneath it, burning through an entire brutal winter. And there is something else worth noticing here, a contrast that still catches me slightly off guard every time I think about it properly. The very fire that Alice built with her own frozen hands in a room she was rarely permitted to sit beside for more than a few stolen minutes existed entirely for someone else's comfort. She created warmth all day long for other people in other rooms, while her own attic bedroom sat exactly as cold at midnight as it had been the night before. If that does not tell you something honest about how Victorian society valued different kinds of women differently, I'm not entirely sure what would. But servants, difficult as their lives clearly were, at least had wages coming in however small, and a roof however cold guaranteed over their heads. There was another kind of woman that winter facing something arguably harder still, not because her hands were cracked from carrying coal, but because society had decided quite firmly that a woman of her particular standing was not supposed to work with her hands at all. No fireplaces to light for wages, no uniform, no position, no household willing to take her in and feed her in exchange for her labour. Just the same freezing house, the same shrinking coal supply, and almost no acceptable way left to earn the money that might have solved both problems at once. That contradiction, and the women forced to live inside it, is exactly where we need to turn next. Let's meet her now, this other kind of woman, because her name deserves to be spoken just as clearly as the others we've already come to know tonight. Call her Harriet. Somewhere in her middle years, widowed the previous spring when her husband, a moderately successful shopkeeper, died suddenly of a fever that swept through their neighbourhood. For 20 years, Harriet had never once had to think about coal prices or rent or how many candles remained in the drawer. Her husband had handled all of it the way Victorian society expected a husband to. And then almost overnight, none of that knowledge existed inside her own head at all, because nobody had ever thought to teach it to her. Picture her sitting in her own parlour that particular winter, in a chair that once belonged to a household with 2 incomes worth of comfort behind it, wearing black mourning silk that had cost more than she could sensibly justify, replacing with something warmer, doing sums on a scrap of paper by a fire she'd already learned to build smaller than the one her husband used to lay without a second thought. The furniture around her still looked respectable. The silverware still gleamed on the sideboard, mostly untouched now, because selling it felt like admitting something she was not yet ready to admit out loud. Respectability, it turned out, could sit in a room right alongside genuine hunger, the two of them occupying the exact same 4 walls without either one fully announcing itself to a visitor at the door. Here is the strange, quietly cruel bind. Harriet found herself standing inside that winter, one that took me a genuine moment to fully understand when I first came across it properly. A working-class woman like Alice, whom we just spent our last section with, could at least sell her labour exhausting and underpaid as it was. She could scrub floors, carry coal-light fires for wages, however small those wages happened to be. Harriet could not. Not because she lacked the physical capability, because Victorian respectability simply did not allow it. A woman of her particular social standing appearing in public as a domestic servant, a shop assistant or a factory worker would have humiliated not only herself, but every relative connected to her name. The same society that left her with almost no money also forbade her from earning any in most of the ordinary ways available to poorer women. Historians have a fittingly understated name for this particular trap. They call it genteel poverty, respectability and desperation occupying the exact same small cold room at once. Whether a widow like Harriet actually suffered through that winter depended almost entirely on one thing, something completely outside her own control. What exactly had her husband left behind? Some widows in Victorian England inherited genuine wealth, sound investments, a paid-off house, perhaps even a small annuity that arrived reliably every quarter, regardless of the weather outside. These women could and did live comfortably, sometimes heading entire households of their own dependence with real financial independence, a position remarkably few other women in this era ever experienced. Census records from various English cities, in fact, show precisely this kind of range, sitting side by side on the very same street. One widow employing servants of her own, only a few doors down from another widow taking in lodgers simply to keep her own roof over her head. 2 women identical loss living winters that could hardly have looked more different from each other, but plenty of other widows, Harriet very much among them, inherited considerably less. A husband's small shop once he died, often died, along with him, its stock sold off cheaply, its debts settled, first leaving whatever remained to a wife who had never once been trained to manage money, because managing money had never in 20 years of marriage been considered her job. Widowhood was not the only path that led a woman into this particular kind of cold either. Plenty of women reached Harriet's exact predicament without ever marrying at all. Victorian England contained a remarkably significant number of women who simply never wed, whether by choice, by circumstance, or because the mathematics of the era, with so many men lost to distant colonial postings, dangerous trades, or simply outnumbered by the women around them in certain regions, left more women unmarried than society quite knew what to do with. These women carried an unkind label at the time, spinster, a word that has softened considerably in meaning since, but back then landed with real social sting attached. And yet their situation, financially speaking, mirrored Harriet's almost exactly. No husband's income to rely on, no manual trade considered acceptable for a woman of respectable birth. The same short, unsatisfying list of options, governess, companion, needlework waiting for them too, sometimes for an entire lifetime rather than the aftermath of a single loss. There is a particular legal detail worth pausing on here because I think it explains a great deal about why this situation existed in the first place. Under the law at the time, a married woman's money and property belonged quite literally to her husband the moment she married him. Everything she brought into the marriage, everything she might have earned during it, legally became his. Only as a widow or as a woman who had never married at all could Harriet actually own property in her own name again, free and clear. It is a strange kind of freedom to finally receive, is it not, precisely at the moment grief has left you least equipped to use it? So what could a woman like Harriet actually do once the small remaining money began to run out, and the coal bin emptied faster than she could refill it? Victorian society offered her a remarkably short list of acceptable options, and every single one of them came with its own particular cost. She might become a governess living inside someone else's household, educating someone else's children in exchange for a modest wage and a room of her own. It sounds on the surface almost gentle compared to what Alice endured. It rarely was. A governess occupied one of the strangest social positions Victorian England ever created, too educated and too refined to eat with the servants, yet never quite considered a proper member of the family employing her either. She belonged fully to neither world, which meant she often belonged in any meaningful social sense to nobody at all. Writers of the period who studied this particular occupation described it quite bluntly as one of the least enviable positions available to a genteel woman precisely because of that constant grinding social limbo. And practically speaking, that isolation had a direct effect on how she experienced winter specifically. Household fuel allowances in many homes were distributed according to social rank, and a governess frequently found herself near the very bottom of that particular list, well below the family she taught, sometimes even below senior servants who had worked in the house for decades. Her bedroom fire, if she was permitted one at all, was often the smallest, the latest lit, and the first one allowed to die down for the night. She might spend her entire day surrounded by a warm occupied schoolroom, and still climb the stairs each evening to a bedroom barely warmer than the corridor outside it, with nobody in the household quite close enough to her in either direction to notice or mind. Alternatively, she might become what Victorian society called a lady's companion, a role that frankly still strikes me as one of the more quietly heartbreaking arrangements this entire era produced. A companion existed to keep an older or unwell woman from being alone reading aloud to her, walking with her, sitting beside her through long winter afternoons in exchange for room board, and depending entirely on the generosity of the family involved, sometimes barely any actual wage at all. She dined with the family when there were no guests present, and quietly vanished to her own room the moment company arrived, an arrangement that preserved the appearance of gentility while offering almost none of its actual security. Her entire position rested on the goodwill and continued good health of a single other person, a precarious foundation for anyone to build a whole winter on, let alone an entire life. If her employer died, which given the role happened with some regularity, a companion could find herself unemployed, homeless, and grieving all at exactly the same freezing moment with no severance, no pension, and often precious little warning. One winter she might be reading quietly by a shared fire, entirely secure in her small familiar routine. The next, she could be standing outside that same house with a single trunk, a letter of recommendation if she was fortunate, and absolutely nowhere yet decided to go. Needlework offered a third path, and on paper, it sounds almost dignified. A skilled seamstress sewing fine dresses for wealthier women could technically work from the relative safety of her own home, avoiding the social exposure of a shop counter or a schoolroom entirely. In practice, dressmaking wages during this period were notoriously thin, and the hours required to earn even a modest sum were brutal, often stretching well past midnight during the busy winter, social season, straining already tired eyes by candlelight that cost money she could barely spare in the first place. A woman bent over fine silk in a cold room, squinting at tiny precise stitches by a single candle flame, because a second one felt like an extravagance, was hardly the picture of gentility polite society liked to imagine when it approved of needlework as an acceptable trade for a respectable widow. More than one contemporary writer described needlework as providing little beyond what they bluntly called poverty wages, a phrase that has stuck with me since I first read it, because it captures something these polite Victorian euphemisms usually worked so hard to hide. And if none of those options quite fit her circumstances, a widow with a house slightly too large for herself alone might take in a lodger, renting out a spare room to a respectable stranger for a modest weekly sum. This solution came with its own quiet social risk, since an unmarried or widowed woman sharing her home with an unrelated man, however proper the arrangement, invited exactly the kind of gossip Victorian respectability was so carefully designed to avoid. There was, I will admit, something almost darkly funny about the whole situation if you squint at it from enough distance. Society would rather Harriet sat alone in a half-empty house slowly running out of coal than risk the faintest whisper of impropriety by accepting rent from the wrong sort of stranger. Warmth was negotiable. Reputation apparently was not. Harriet, weighing her freezing coal bin against her remaining reputation, was forced to calculate which particular danger felt more survivable that winter. "Can I ask you something honestly, because I have wondered about it myself more than once while researching this? Which of those options would you have chosen if you were standing exactly where Harriet stood, with a coal bin running low and a calendar full of unpaid bills stretching well into spring?" There truly was no comfortable answer waiting among any of them. Every single path available to her asked her to trade away something that mattered: her independence, her privacy, her already fragile social standing, simply for the chance to stay warm through one more winter. Here is where I want to offer you my own honest opinion on all of this, because I think it deserves saying plainly. We often talk about Victorian rules around respectable femininity as though they were primarily concerned with protecting women. Sitting with Harriet's actual circumstances for a while now, I am no longer entirely convinced that protection was ever really the point. A working woman like Alice, however exhausted, however underpaid, at least had a guaranteed wage and a guaranteed roof for as long as her position lasted. Harriet protected so thoroughly from ever needing to earn her own living, the ordinary way was left instead, with almost no reliable income at all, and precious few socially acceptable paths back toward earning any. It is a strange, uncomfortable kind of irony when you actually sit with it for a while. The very rules meant to shield women like Harriet from hardship often left them considerably less equipped to survive it, once hardship inevitably arrived at their own front door. Protection, it seems, worked reasonably well right up until the exact moment it was actually needed, and then it quietly, almost invisibly stepped aside. It is worth remembering, too, that the poor law itself recognized something of this particular vulnerability, even if it never managed to solve it. Widows with children were treated somewhat differently under the system than other applicants, permitted in many cases to continue receiving assistance in their own homes, rather than being forced directly into a workhouse the moment their money ran out. It was a small, imperfect acknowledgement that widowhood created a distinct kind of crisis, one that ordinary poor relief had to bend itself slightly to address. Small comfort, admittedly, to a woman sitting alone in a cooling parlour, doing arithmetic that simply refused to balance, no matter how many times she worked through it by candlelight, wondering whether her own particular version of respectable poverty would still count for anything at all if it finally fully collapsed. And that particular acknowledgement matters more than it might first appear, because for every widow like Harriet who still had a house, however cold, and a coal bin however nearly empty, there were countless other women that same winter with nothing left standing between themselves and the street outside at all. No respectable position waiting to be found, no spare room to offer a lodger, no family name left to protect because protecting it had already cost them everything they once had. Their winter looked nothing like Harriet's or Alice's or even Eliza's. It looked considerably colder and considerably more dangerous, stripped of every last polite fiction. Victorian society still allowed Harriet to hold on to, and it is exactly where our story needs to travel next. There is a particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature at all, and it belongs entirely to the women we need to talk about now, because these were the women that particular winter left, with no room to sit in cold, or otherwise no house of any size, however empty its coal bin, still standing between them and the open street. Harriet, whatever her struggles, still had 4 walls around her that winter. Alice, however exhausted, still had an attic bedroom waiting at the end of her working day. The women in this next chapter had neither, and their story asks something slightly different of us than the ones we've heard so far tonight. I want to tell you something true first, something documented by an actual London police superintendent in the closing years of the 1800s, because I think it says more than any statistic could manage on its own. Officers patrolling the parks at night made a habit of encouraging homeless women they encountered to seek shelter properly in a workhouse, in one of the charitable homes scattered around the city, or at the very least in what was called a casual ward, a kind of overnight refuge for exactly this situation. And according to that same superintendent's own account, a striking number of these women simply refused. Not out of confusion, not out of ignorance about what was being offered. They refused in their own words because they wanted to remain independent. Sit with that phrase for a moment because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. These were women choosing a freezing London night in the open air over the shelter of an institution built at least on paper specifically to help them. That is not the choice of someone confused about her own danger. That is the choice of someone who understood with painful clarity exactly what both options actually cost her, and decided the cold somehow was the smaller price. To understand why we need to talk honestly about what a Victorian workhouse actually was, because the popular image, some warm charitable refuge dispensing kindly soup to the deserving poor, could hardly be further from the documented reality. Workhouses existed under a system of relief that classified poverty itself almost as a moral failing requiring correction, rather than simple misfortune requiring assistance. Admission meant surrendering an enormous amount of personal autonomy in exchange for a bed and a meal. Families were routinely separated by sex and age the moment they walked through the door, husbands housed, apart from wives, older children, apart from their own mothers, on the theory that allowing families to remain together might make the workhouse feel too comfortable, too much like an acceptable alternative to honest labour. A mother arriving with a child old enough to be classified separately might not see that child again, except at rare, supervised intervals, an arrangement designed less around cruelty for its own sake than around a rigid, almost mathematical belief that comfort and charity mixed together too generously would only encourage idleness. Uniforms replaced whatever clothing a person arrived wearing, stripping away, along with the fabric itself, a small but meaningful piece of a person's own identity. Meals were meagre and monotonous, calculated with real precision to sit just above outright starvation and nowhere near comfort. And able-bodied inmates, women very much included, were required to labour in exchange for their keep, often at deliberately unpleasant tasks specifically chosen to discourage anyone from viewing the workhouse as an easy way out. Women frequently found themselves picking oakum, pulling apart old tarred rope fibre by fibre with raw bleeding fingers until it could be reused for caulking ships, a task chosen less for its usefulness than for how thoroughly unpleasant it was to perform for hours at a stretch. The message embedded in that particular choice of labour was never especially subtle. Relief was available, yes, but only at a cost carefully designed to feel like punishment rather than kindness. Here is a detail from the historical record that I think truly surprised me the first time I properly understood its scale. Admission numbers across English workhouses climbed dramatically as that century wore on, roughly doubling between the middle of the 1800s and the very start of the 1900s, and within that overall rise, winter consistently produced its own sharp, predictable spike. Agricultural labourers with no work once the harvest ended. Vagrants with nowhere else left to turn once the temperature dropped low enough to make sleeping outdoors a real gamble with their own life. The workhouse door, in other words, functioned almost like a pressure valve for an entire society's poverty opening widest, precisely when the weather turned most dangerous and closing again. Relatively speaking, once spring finally arrived, and the immediate threat of freezing eased, researchers who have combed carefully through workhouse census records also found something worth mentioning here because it quietly complicates the picture most of us carry around in our heads. Working-age adults, the group we most naturally picture when we imagine poverty, actually made up a smaller share of workhouse populations than you might expect given how large that group was in the wider population outside those walls. Elderly residents, by contrast, grew steadily more common inside workhouses as the century progressed, eventually forming the single largest group housed there by its final decades. Among women specifically, workhouse populations consistently included a meaningful, steady presence. Women who had aged out of domestic service with no pension waiting for them, women whose health had simply failed too early for any of the paths we discussed a moment ago to still remain open. Picture Alice decades further along in her own life, her back finally giving out after years of hauling coal scuttles up those same narrow stairs, with no savings left behind and no family willing or able to take her in. The workhouse, in other words, was never really designed around the able-bodied poor alone. It quietly became something closer to the only safety net available for women who had simply outlived every other option society had ever offered them. And yet, even facing exactly that threat, plenty of women still chose the street instead. Why would anyone make that particular choice when the alternative, however grim at least, offered 4 walls and a roof? I think the honest answer has almost nothing to do with comfort, and almost everything to do with what admission actually meant afterward for the rest of a woman's life. Entering a workhouse carried a stigma in Victorian England that followed a person well beyond the institution's own walls. It could affect future employment, future respectability, future prospects for marriage or reconciliation with family who might otherwise have helped. For a woman clinging to whatever fragments of independence and self-respect remained available to her, that particular door once walked through could feel less like temporary shelter and more like a permanent verdict on exactly who she now was, So instead, remarkable numbers of women simply found their own way through using whatever resources the city itself indifferent, as it was happened to leave lying around. Let me tell you about two of them specifically, because their story has stayed with me since I first came across it, and I think it deserves to be told properly, rather than reduced to a single grim statistic. Two young women, according to that same period account, spent many consecutive nights sheltering inside the hollow trunk of an old elm tree in one of London's public parks. The tree itself was large enough remarkably to hold not only the two of them, but a pair of park chairs they had carried inside with them, presumably for something at least resembling a proper place to sit rather than bare damp wood. Each night they arranged their shawls carefully across the opening of that hollow trunk, fashioning something close to a door out of nothing more than fabric and sheer necessity, before settling in against a cold that would have killed a less resourceful pair within a single season. Think about the sheer deliberate effort behind that small routine for a moment. This was not one desperate night stumbled through by accident. This was a repeated, refined system improved upon night after night, the two women presumably learning from each previous attempt exactly how the chairs should sit, exactly how tightly the shawls needed to be pulled across the gap to keep the worst of the draught out, exactly what time they needed to claim their spot before anyone else discovered the same hollow trunk and its unusual advantages. They had, in the truest sense of the word, built themselves a home, however small, however temporary, out of a dying tree, and whatever else the city happened to leave lying within reach. I want you to picture that scene properly, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention in the middle of a long list of grim facts. Two women, likely still quite young, working together night after night to turn a dying tree into something resembling shelter-hauling furniture into a hollow trunk, with the same careful practicality Alice brought to lighting a dozen fireplaces before sunrise, the same quiet resourcefulness Eliza showed kneeling over her own dying fire. This was not desperation without thought behind it. This was genuine ingenuity applied to circumstances that should never have required ingenuity from anyone in the first place. Can I ask you something honestly? When you picture homelessness in Victorian London, what image comes to mind first? I suspect for most of us, it involves a single figure alone, hunched in a doorway, more a passive victim of circumstance than an active problem solver. I think that image, however sympathetic, actually does these women a disservice. The two in that hollow tree were not simply enduring their situation, they were managing it, adapting to it, building something functional out of almost nothing together night after night. There is a kind of quiet strength in that particular story that deserves recognition alongside the tragedy of it. And honestly, the more time I spend with this era, the more I find myself drawn to exactly that kind of overlooked ingenuity rather than the misery alone. Other women found their own version of the same resourcefulness elsewhere across the city. Doorways offered a small measure of shelter from the worst gusts of cold air, if not from the temperature itself. Park benches, despite offering almost no protection at all, remained a common refuge simply because they were available and free, and a woman could at least keep moving between several of them across a single night if one location started to feel unsafe. Bridges with their overhangs drew their own share of women seeking whatever partial cover they could find between one freezing hour and the next, huddled close together in small informal groups that offered a measure of warmth, and perhaps more importantly a measure of safety in numbers that a single woman alone could never quite manage on her own. Newspaper sellers and market women who had reason to be up and moving before dawn regardless, sometimes let a homeless woman shelter briefly near their stalls in exchange for small errands, run in return a quiet, informal economy of survival, operating entirely outside anything an official record would ever think to note. And when even these options failed, or when the weather turned dangerous enough to overcome even the fear of that lasting stigma, a woman might finally present herself at a casual ward, after all a slightly gentler entry point than the full workhouse system, offering a single night's shelter and a basic meal in exchange for a few hours of required labour the following morning, before being sent right back out into whatever the city had waiting for her next. Here is where I want to share my own honest perspective, because I think this particular part of the story asks something uncomfortable of anyone listening tonight. We often assume that offering help automatically solves a problem, that the mere existence of an institution meant to assist the poor should have been enough full-stop end of discussion. What this tells us quite plainly is that help offered without dignity attached to it is not always experienced as help at all. These women were not rejecting shelter because they failed to understand its value. They were weighing that shelter against a real well-founded fear of what it would cost them afterward, weighing warmth for one night against a stigma that might follow them for years, and in a remarkable number of documented cases deciding the cold itself, however dangerous, was the more survivable choice between two truly bad options. That is not a comfortable thought to sit with, and I do not think it should be. It asks us to hold two things true at the exact same time: that Victorian society truly failed these women in almost every meaningful way, and that the women themselves were never simply helpless in the face of that failure. But I also think there is something worth honouring here, something easy to miss if we only focus on the danger itself. These women were not simply victims of a brutal winter and an indifferent city. They were problem solvers working with whatever materials the world happened to leave within reach, refusing even under circumstances that would break most of us entirely to surrender the last thing that still truly belonged to them. But even the most resourceful improvised shelter, a hollow tree, a borrowed doorway, a park bench softened by nothing more than a worn shawl, could only hold out against so much. And that particular winter, the one Eliza herself was living through, as our story began tonight, was about to test every single one of these women sheltered or not housed, or not against something far more extreme than an ordinary cold season. It was about to become one of the coldest winters this entire country had ever recorded, cold enough to freeze rivers solid and silence an entire city. And that is exactly the story we need to step into next. Here is something almost hard to believe, and I want you to sit with the sheer length of it before we go any further. The frost that gripped England that particular winter arrived in the final week of December and simply did not let go. Not for a week, not for a month. It held the entire country in an unbroken grip for nearly 2 full months, easing only toward the very end of February, long after most families had run out of coal patience, and in more cases than anyone at the time wanted to publicly admit hope. There was no single terrifying night to point to no one dramatic storm that swept through and then departed, leaving everyone free to recover. That would almost have been easier to survive, honestly, a single sharp shock followed by relief. What actually happened was slower and in its own way considerably crueler. Morning after morning brought the same hard frost. Week after week the same grey bitter sky refused to offer even a single day's reprieve. Church bells rang out over streets that stayed frozen and empty for far longer than anyone alive could remember, and the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a person after weeks without relief, physical, financial, and quietly emotional, all at once began working its way into households across the entire country. Think about what that actually means for a moment. 2 months without a single real thaw. 2 months of every single detail we have already spent this evening exploring together: Eliza's 20 minutes, rebuilding her fire, Alice's dozen freezing fireplaces, Harriet's careful arithmetic with her dwindling coal, the two women sheltering inside their hollow tree, repeated day after day after day, without so much as one merciful break in between. Whatever exhaustion each of these women was already carrying by January this particular winter simply kept adding to it week after relentless week with absolutely no sign of relenting. And then something happened that turned this entire crisis into one of the most visually striking moments Victorian England ever produced. The Thames itself began to freeze. Not thin decorative ice along the edges, the kind that forms most winters, and vanishes within a day or two once the sun climbs high enough. Real ice thick enough in places to bear real weight, spreading slowly across a river that this entire city had built its identity around for close to 2,000 years. And once word spread that the ice could truly hold a person's weight, Londoners did exactly what you might expect any crowd of people to do when faced with something that's strange and rare. They went out to see it for themselves. The Serpentine, that long curving lake tucked inside Hyde Park, froze solid enough that winter to draw crowds of skaters gliding across its surface, bundled in furs and wool, laughing, calling out to each other, moving in slow, graceful loops across ice that only a short distance away was quietly threatening the lives of women who'd nowhere warm to escape to once the light faded. Vendors reportedly set up along the frozen edges selling hot drinks to the skaters, small fires burning in braziers to warm cold hands, between turns on the ice an almost festive little economy, springing up practically overnight around what was everywhere else in the city an unfolding emergency. I find something truly difficult to sit with in that particular image, honestly, and I think it deserves more than a passing mention. The very same freeze that was pushing homeless women toward hollow trees and desperate improvisation was at that exact same moment providing an afternoon of pure delight for anyone wealthy enough, healthy enough, and warmly dressed enough to treat it as entertainment instead of a threat. Here is a detail I think will honestly surprise you, and it connects directly back to something we touched on earlier tonight. That soft romantic image most of us carry around, of a proper Victorian Christmas gentle snow blanketing quiet cobbled streets, candlelight glowing warmly behind frosted window panes. The whole picturesque scene, straight off an old holiday card, largely traces back to this exact winter. This was the season more than almost any other that shaped how an entire culture would remember Victorian winter ever afterward. And I think that is worth sitting with for a moment, because the very same weather that produced our comforting, nostalgic image of the era was quite literally killing the poorest women living through it in real time. We inherited the postcard. We rarely inherited the full story sitting just behind it. Because while skaters glided across the Serpentine that particular week, the reality on the other side of the city looked entirely different. Newspapers of the period struggling to describe conditions honestly reported severe disruption to shipping along the Thames itself, ice thick enough in places to threaten boats, and halt deliveries entirely, leaving dock workers, watermen and labourers who depended on the river for their daily wages, suddenly without any income at all, at the precise moment they needed money for coal most desperately. Mass unemployment followed almost immediately in trades connected to outdoor labour, since work that depended on movement on open water, on roads that could actually bear a cart's weight, simply stopped happening. Builders could not lay brick in ground frozen solid beneath their feet. Farm labourers, already scarce in winter, found even the little seasonal work usually available to them vanished entirely once the ground turned hard as iron. Washerwomen whose entire livelihood depended on water that would actually run rather than freeze solid in the tub lost days of income they could never fully recover. Picture the particular cruelty embedded in that timing. The exact same freeze that was driving coal prices higher through sheer demand was also simultaneously cutting off the wages so many families needed to afford that same coal in the first place. It is difficult to imagine a crueler kind of economic trap closing shut from both directions. At once, prices climbing while income vanished, the two curves crossing at exactly the moment a family like Eliza's or Harriet's, or the countless households depending on daily or weekly wages, needed fuel most badly and had the least possible means left to purchase it. Even families who had managed every previous winter reasonably well suddenly found themselves doing the exact same desperate arithmetic Harriet had been doing for months already, only now with considerably less practice at it than she had. Communities, to their credit, did not sit by entirely passively while all of this unfolded. Relief funds sprang up with real urgency that winter organised locally parish by parish, collecting money, blankets and food for families who had exhausted every other option available to them. One such fund, established specifically in response to this particular crisis, drew donations from wealthier residents who had seen the same newspaper reports we have been discussing tonight, and to their credit responded with genuine concern rather than simple indifference. Soup kitchens opened their doors earlier in the season than usual, and stayed open considerably later into the spring than anyone had originally planned for, because the need quite simply refused to ease on any predictable schedule. Volunteers ladled out whatever hot broth and bread the collected donations could stretch, to cover standing for hours themselves in the same brutal cold, serving lines of women and children that grew longer rather than shorter as the weeks dragged on. It was not a perfect system, not nearly enough to reach every woman who needed it, and certainly not enough to undo the deeper structural problems we have spent this entire evening examining. Charity, however well-intentioned, could not rewrite the laws that left widows like Harriet with so few respectable options, or the wages that left servants like Alice earning so little for such punishing labour. But it tells you something meaningful about how seriously this particular winter was taken by the people actually living through it. This was not treated as an ordinary cold snap to simply endure quietly. Communities recognised it correctly as an emergency, even if the response, like so many charitable responses throughout history, arrived a little smaller, and a little later than the crisis itself truly demanded. Let's return for a moment to Eliza, because I think she deserves to hear how her own story continues. That single quiet morning we spent with her at the very beginning of tonight's story, kneeling over her dying fire breath, rising in the cold air of her small room, sat right in the middle of this exact stretch of unbroken frost. Every single day for weeks afterward she faced that same 20-minute battle, over and over, her coal supply shrinking a little further each time, her small savings stretched thinner with every visit to the coal merchant. There was no single dramatic turning point in her particular story, no sudden rescue, no tidy resolution arriving to solve everything at once. There was only the daily unglamorous discipline of getting the fire lit one more time, and then the next morning doing it again through a season that seemed determined to test exactly how long that discipline could hold. Alice across the city faced her own version of the exact same test. A dozen fireplaces became, if anything, an even heavier burden during those particular weeks, since the family she served demanded more fires lit for longer hours, as the cold refused to loosen its grip while her own wages stayed precisely where they had always been. And Harriet, doing her careful sums by candlelight each evening, watched her small remaining savings shrink at a rate that frightened her. More, with every week the frost persisted, coal prices creeping steadily higher across the entire city as demand outpaced what merchants could reliably deliver over roads that had turned treacherous with ice. 3 entirely different women, Three entirely different sets of circumstances, all measuring the exact same unbroken stretch of frost in the exact same unit, how many days their particular resources could possibly stretch to cover. And in a strange, quiet way, I think that is precisely the point worth carrying forward from her story. Survival that winter rarely looked like a single heroic moment. It looked like repetition. It looked like Alice climbing those same servant stairs for the 1000th time. It looked like Harriet doing the same impossible arithmetic by candlelight night after night, refusing to let the numbers defeat her completely. It looked like two women every single evening arranging their shawls across the same hollow tree, adjusting the same two chairs, refining a system that kept them alive one more night at a time. None of it was cinematic. All of it was genuine courage, the unglamorous everyday kind that rarely gets remembered properly, precisely because it never announced itself with a single dramatic headline. I think we do a particular disservice to history whenever we only tell the dramatic version of it. A single skating accident on the Serpentine, a single dramatic rescue from the ice, those are the stories that would naturally make it into a newspaper, precisely because they are exciting and unusual. Nobody wrote a headline about Eliza successfully lighting her fire for the 60th consecutive morning in a row. And yet I would argue that 60th morning took every bit as much strength as anything happening out on that frozen river, possibly more because nobody was there applauding her for it, and nobody would have noticed at all if on any one of those 60 mornings she had simply stopped trying. Can I ask you something? Honestly. When you think about courage, does your mind go first to a single, bold, decisive moment, or to the quiet, exhausting act of simply continuing day after day when nothing about your circumstances has meaningfully improved? I used to assume courage always looked dramatic. Spending this much time with women like Eliza has truly changed my mind about that. Sometimes courage looks exactly like getting up at 5 in the morning to build a fire you already know will only last a few hours because the alternative, giving up entirely, was never actually available to you in the first place. There is something almost funny in a dark, very human way about how thoroughly this single winter got rebranded by history afterward. We turned it into greeting cards. We turned it into cozy period dramas with gentle snow falling picturesquely outside beautifully lit windows. Meanwhile, the actual women who lived through it were mostly just trying to keep their fingers from going numb long enough to finish whatever task stood in front of them. If Eliza, Alice and Harriet could somehow see how fondly we now remember their particular winter, framed on postcards and printed onto holiday sweaters, I suspect at least one of them would have a few pointed words to share with us about it. By the time February finally loosened its grip and the long thaw began, the physical damage this winter had done to England was at least visible and countable. Burst pipes, ruined crops still buried somewhere beneath melting snow, months of lost wages that would take considerably longer than a single spring to fully recover from. Merchants tallied their losses. Parishes tallied their relief spending. Newspapers relieved themselves in their own way, finally found gentler words to describe the weather again, and life across the country slowly, gradually began resembling something closer to normal. But there was another kind of damage this winter left behind too, one that never showed up in any official record, tucked quietly into the joints, the lungs and the general health of every woman who had spent 2 straight months fighting a cold that never once let up. A body does not simply reset itself the moment warmer weather finally arrives. 2 months of chronic cold exposure, poor nutrition stretched thinner than ever, and constant physical strain leave a mark that lingers considerably longer than the frost itself ever did, quietly working its way into a person's health for months, sometimes years after the last patch of snow has melted away entirely. That particular cost, the one written directly onto the body itself, is exactly where our story needs to go next. There is a particular kind of danger that does not announce itself with a dramatic headline or a single freezing night. It moves quietly, settling into a person's chest over weeks and months, and by the time anyone noticed it clearly enough to name it, it had usually already taken hold. That danger had a name almost every Victorian family knew and feared better than nearly any other word in their vocabulary: consumption. We call it tuberculosis today, but I want to use the word Victorian England actually used, because I think it captures something the modern clinical term simply does not: consumption. As though the illness itself was slowly eating a person from the inside out, consuming flesh breath, and eventually life itself one quiet week at a time. It began more often than not with a cough that seemed unremarkable. At first easy enough to blame on the cold air. Everyone was already breathing that winter. Weeks later came a persistent tiredness that sleep never quite fixed, night sweats that left bedding damp even in a freezing room, and a slow, steady loss of appetite that left already thin bodies growing thinner still. And it was not some rare, unusual affliction lurking at the edges of Victorian life. Historians studying mortality records from the period estimate that consumption was responsible for something close to 1 in every 6 deaths across England during the late 1830s alone, a staggering share of an entire nation's mortality concentrated inside a single poorly understood disease. Here is where the story takes a turn I think truly deserves your full attention, because it reveals something uncomfortable about how societies decide which suffering to fear and which suffering astonishingly to admire instead. Consumption did not strike every level of society equally. Mortality records from 1838 and 1839 show that somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of tradesmen and labourers who died that period died specifically from this disease, compared to roughly 1 in 6 among the wealthier gentleman class. The difference was never really mysterious, even at the time, once you consider everything we have already discussed tonight. Poorer families lived in crowded, poorly ventilated rooms, often the very same single heated room we described several sections ago, where an entire household slept, cooked and breathed the same recycled air night after night through the coldest months. Malnutrition weakened already vulnerable bodies further, and once a household's carefully rationed coal ran short, the cold itself compounded every other risk factor already stacked against them. Consumption, in other words, was never simply bad luck. It was a disease that thrived precisely in the exact conditions poverty and a brutal winter created together. Think back for a moment to Alice climbing those same servant stairs morning after morning, sleeping in an attic room that stayed cold enough all winter to encourage her to keep the small window firmly shut against every last draught she could manage to block. That instinct sealing a room tightly against the cold made perfect sense given everything we discussed about heat loss earlier tonight. It also happened to be precisely the kind of poorly ventilated, tightly sealed space where an airborne illness like consumption could spread most easily between exhausted bodies packed together for warmth. The very same survival strategy that kept a person from freezing could, without anyone intending it quietly, increase their risk of catching the disease that killed more Victorians than almost anything else. There was no comfortable contradiction-free way to survive a winter like this one. Nearly every choice carried some hidden cost stacked against another, and yet remarkably wealthier Victorian society did something with this same disease that I still find difficult to fully wrap my head around. They made it beautiful. Not despite its symptoms, but almost entirely because of them, in a way that still feels from this distance close to unbelievable once you actually sit with the details properly. Pale skin, a faint feverish flush across the cheeks, reddened lips, a slender, almost fragile thinness that came from a body slowly losing its appetite as the illness progressed. Every single one of these symptoms of a disease actively killing the person displaying them became in the drawing rooms and fashion plates of wealthier Victorian England markers of genuine beauty. Poets before this era had already helped set the stage for this particular fascination. John Keats, one of the most celebrated romantic poets of the age, died of consumption at only 25 years old, and rather than serving purely as a tragedy, his death helped cement an entire cultural association between the disease artistic sensitivity and a kind of doomed romantic fragility that wealthier society found almost unbelievably attractive. Painters picked up exactly where the poets left off. Artists working in the style that came to be known for its pale, ethereal female subjects deliberately sought out models whose features already echoed the consumptive look: hollow cheeks, luminous pale skin, an air of delicate otherworldly fragility that had quite literally become the fashionable beauty standard of an entire era. Novelists of the period leaned on the exact same association just as heavily, and if you've ever noticed how many tragic heroines in classic literature from this century seem to fade away, slowly growing more beautiful and more spiritually refined, the closer they come to their own deaths, you have already noticed this pattern working itself out on the page. A slow wasting illness became in fiction, after fiction, a way to make a female character seem more delicate, more soulful, more worthy of the reader's sympathy, precisely because her body was failing her, in a manner 19th century audiences had been culturally trained to find moving rather than merely tragic. Fashion followed close behind literature and painting both. Corsets of the period were designed specifically to emphasize an impossibly narrow waist, mimicking the wasting thinness that consumption produced naturally in the women it was actually killing. Cosmetics were used to whiten skin and redden lips, and cheeks, artificially chasing an appearance that for an enormous number of women across the country required no cosmetics at all, only illness, malnutrition, and a home too cold and too crowded to keep the sickness at bay. Can you feel the particular cruelty sitting underneath that fact? Somewhere in a cramped single-room tenement, a working-class woman was coughing through another freezing night, her body visibly wasting away from a disease she had no real access to treat. And somewhere else, only a few streets away, a wealthy woman was carefully applying powder to her own healthy skin, trying her very best to look exactly like that same dying woman, because society had decided without any apparent irony at all that the appearance of consumption was elegant, so long as the actual disease stayed safely on the other side of the city. I want to ask you something honestly, because this particular contradiction has stayed with me since I first properly understood it. Can you think of anything in our own modern culture that mirrors this same pattern, where the visible signs of someone else's genuine hardship become once removed from their original painful context, treated as aspirational or fashionable? Instead, I suspect if you sit with that question for even a moment, more than one example will come to mind rather uncomfortably quickly. History, it turns out, is considerably better at repeating its uglier habits than most of us would like to admit. Medicine at the time offered painfully little real help against any of this, though it certainly was not for lack of confident claims. Quack doctors, as they were bluntly called even then, built entire careers promising cures for consumption that had absolutely no basis in actual medical understanding. One particularly notorious practitioner claimed he could cure the disease through a special liniment, rubbed onto the skin combined with medicated vapours, building himself a considerable fortune and reputation on the strength of that claim alone, treating wealthy, desperate patients willing to pay handsomely for even the faintest promise of hope. He died with a bitter irony that feels almost too neat to be true of consumption himself at only 36 years old, felled by the exact disease he had spent years insisting he knew how to defeat. I will admit there is something darkly funny about that particular ending, in the way history occasionally delivers its own justice without anyone actually planning it that way. Proper physicians, to be fair, were not entirely without theories either, even if most of those theories now sound almost as questionable as the quack remedies they were competing against. Fresh air, ironically, was one of the more sensible recommendations doctors did eventually settle on, along with rest and, for anyone wealthy enough to manage it, travel to a warmer, drier climate believed to ease the lungs. That particular treatment naturally remained entirely out of reach for a woman like Alice, or the two women sheltering in their hollow tree women whose entire winter was already defined by seeking warmth rather than fleeing toward it. Prescribing sunshine and a change of climate to someone who could not afford coal for her own single fireplace was in its own quiet way just another example of how thoroughly this era's medical advice, like so much else we've discussed tonight, was really only designed with wealthier patients in mind. Ordinary households unable to afford fashionable quack remedies, or a season spent recovering somewhere warmer, relied instead on whatever home treatments had been passed down through generations, warm flannel wrapped tightly around the chest, various herbal concoctions brewed and reheated by the same single fire. We've spent this whole evening discussing honey and vinegar mixtures meant to soothe a persistent cough that in reality no kitchen remedy could ever meaningfully touch. None of it worked, not in any way that modern medicine would recognize as effective, but I think there is something worth honoring in the attempt itself, women caring for their own families and neighbors with whatever limited tools an era without real medical answers had actually given them. Chilblains, which we touched on briefly earlier tonight when we first met Eliza, kneeling over her cold floor, deserve one further mention here, because winters like the brutal stretch we just spent an entire section exploring together made them considerably worse than an ordinary season ever would. Weeks of chronic cold combined with poor circulation and the malnutrition, so many households were already struggling against left skin, cracked, swollen and painfully sensitive across hands and feet that simply never got a proper chance to fully warm through and heal between one freezing day and the next. Left untreated for long enough, and treatment, remember, was rarely available to a woman with no spare coin for a doctor, those same cracked chilblains could become infected, turning what began as a minor seasonal irritation into a far more serious threat to a body already weakened by everything else this winter had already demanded of it. Here is my honest opinion on everything we have covered in this particular section, for whatever it is worth to you. We have spent this whole evening discussing a season that Victorian society eventually turned into something soft and nostalgic, a holiday card, a comforting winter memory. This particular chapter shows that same pattern playing out again in an even more unsettling way. A disease that was quietly devastating the poorest households in the country became through nothing more than distance and privilege, something the wealthy found beautiful enough to imitate on purpose. I do not think that pattern is uniquely Victorian, honestly. I think it says something a little uncomfortable about how easily any society can admire the aesthetics of suffering right up until the moment it actually has to live through the suffering itself. It is remarkably easy to romanticize a cough from across a ballroom. It is considerably harder to romanticize it while you are the one lying awake with it at 3 a.m, wondering whether you will have the strength to build tomorrow's fire. A woman who had just spent 2 straight months fighting the kind of winter we described earlier tonight, exhausted thinner than she had been in autumn, breathing the same crowded air night after night in a room too cold to properly ventilate, was without ever fully realizing it standing exactly at the crossroads where all of this danger converged. Cold alone rarely killed a woman outright. It simply opened every door that something else consumption chilblains turned to infection. Sheer physical exhaustion could then walk straight through. And the particular cruelty of it all is that the very same women society was quietly failing through poverty. Poor housing and impossible economic choices were also without any say in the matter, the ones paying the steepest physical price for every single failure stacked on top of them. But surviving that particular convergence of dangers was never only about medicine or luck, or the household a woman happened to be born into. It was also about the small, practical, remarkably clever tools women passed down to each other, generation after generation, tools that did not cure disease, but that quietly, patiently kept the worst of winter's danger from ever fully reaching them in the first place. Some of those tools were physical objects, warmed stones, careful layering small kindnesses shared between neighbours who had almost nothing else left to share. Others were simply knowledge passed from mother to daughter, from one exhausted household to another, about exactly how to stretch a dwindling coal supply 1 week further than it should reasonably have lasted, or how to keep a sick child's chest warm through the worst hours of the night. And that particular kind of resourcefulness, the everyday genius so many of these women relied on simply to make it through to spring, deserves a far warmer chapter than the one we've just finished. It is exactly where we need to turn next. Let's start with a trick that would have saved Eliza an enormous amount of trouble on that very first morning we spent together tonight, because I think it deserves proper attention now that we finally have the chance to slow down and actually explain it. Remember those 20 long minutes she spent kneeling on a freezing floor, striking flint against steel, coaxing a single stubborn spark into something resembling a fire? Countless Victorian women avoided that exact struggle entirely not through luck, but through a quiet, practiced piece of household knowledge called banking a fire. Rather than letting the coals burn down to nothing overnight, an experienced woman would carefully smother her fire in its own ash, before bed packing it down tightly enough to starve the flame of air without fully extinguishing the heat underneath. Done correctly, a handful of embers could survive a full 8 hours buried beneath that gentle blanket of ash, waiting patiently until morning. Instead of building an entire fire from nothing, all a woman needed to do was gently rake that ash aside, uncover a few surviving embers still glowing faintly orange, and coax them back to life with fresh kindling in a fraction of the time it took to start completely from scratch. It sounds almost absurdly simple. Once you hear it explained properly and honestly, that is exactly what makes it so remarkable. This was not some rare, specialized skill known only to professional servants. It was ordinary household wisdom passed from mother to daughter, from one exhausted neighbor to another. Precisely the kind of practical genius that never once made it into a history book, because nobody at the time considered it worth writing down. Why would they? Everybody already knew it. Picture an older, more experienced woman on Eliza Street, someone who had survived 40 winters, exactly like this one, showing a younger neighbour how to pack that ash correctly for the first time, how tightly to press it down, how to judge by touch alone whether enough air still reached the embers underneath to keep them alive until morning. That single piece of shared knowledge offered freely over a garden wall or a shared washing line could save an exhausted woman a full 20 minutes of freezing, frustrating labour every single morning for an entire season. And yet, from where we are sitting tonight, more than a century later, it feels almost like a small miracle of quiet efficiency, the kind of clever trick that would have made Eliza's entire freezing morning considerably shorter If only someone had thought to teach it to her before that particular winter began. Can I ask you something? Honestly, how many small, unglamorous pieces of practical wisdom do you think we are quietly losing right now in our own generation, simply because nobody considers them important enough to pass along properly? I think about that more than I probably should, and I suspect the answer is considerably more than any of us would like to admit. Once the fire itself was sorted, the next battle Victorian women fought was getting an actual bed warm enough to sleep in. And this particular problem produced two competing solutions, each with its own very real trade-offs. The first older solution was the warming pan, a wide, shallow copper pan with a long wooden handle filled with hot coals or glowing embers taken directly from the household fire. A woman would slide that pan between the sheets and move it steadily back and forth across the mattress, spreading warmth evenly before climbing into bed herself, working quickly and methodically, the way anyone does when handling something capable of scorching the very thing it is meant to protect. It worked remarkably well, and honestly, there is something almost luxurious about the idea of climbing into a bed that someone had deliberately warmed for you ahead of time, sheets still holding a faint trace of that gentle, radiant heat as you settled in against the cold night air pressing at the window. But it also carried a real constant risk. Move too slowly, or let the pan linger too long in one particular spot, and you could scorch the sheets, or worse, actually set the bedding alight, an alarming enough possibility that plenty of households eventually moved towards something considerably safer instead. That safer alternative involved simple stones or bricks heated for hours beside the household fire until they held a deep, steady warmth, then wrapped carefully in flannel or an old scrap of blanket and tucked down near the foot of the bed. A heated brick could not scorch anything the way a pan full of glowing coals could, and it held its warmth for a remarkably impressive stretch of the night, slowly releasing heat rather than delivering it all at once. Poorer households leaned on this particular method almost universally, since it required nothing more than a fire already burning for other purposes, and an old blanket nobody minded sacrificing to the cause. I rather love this particular solution, if I'm honest with you. There is something quietly poetic about an ordinary stone warmed by the same fire that cooked a family's dinner, doing one last useful job before the household finally settled in for the night. And speaking of using ordinary objects in slightly unexpected ways, let me tell you about one of my personal favourite pieces of Victorian winter ingenuity, because I think it deserves to be far better known than it currently is. A hot-baked potato, fresh from the fire, tucked directly into a coat pocket, made a truly effective portable hand warmer, holding its heat for a remarkably long stretch of time, as a person walked to market or to church, or simply between one freezing errand and the next. I will admit there is something rather wonderful about the mental image of a properly dressed Victorian woman, gloves on bonnet tied walking briskly down a frozen street, with a warm potato quietly doing its job in her coat pocket the entire time. It is not glamorous. It is also, from a purely practical standpoint, a remarkably brilliant solution to a real problem, using something every kitchen already had on hand, rather than spending money the household simply did not have. But I think the most important survival tool this whole story has to offer was never really an object at all. It was other people. Victorian women, particularly the ones we've spent this entire evening getting to know, rarely survived winter through pure individual effort alone, however much that image of the lone stoic woman fighting the cold single-handedly might make for a compelling picture. Neighbours leaned on each other constantly in small, practical, largely undocumented ways that never quite made it into any official record, precisely because nobody involved considered them remarkable at the time. A woman with a slightly fuller coal bin might share a scuttle with the widow next door quietly without ceremony, simply because she understood exactly how close her own household had come to the same situation the previous winter. Women minded each other's children during the coldest weeks, allowing a mother to take on extra sewing work or an extra shift. Without paying for care, she could not afford an informal economy of favours that kept entire streets functioning through the worst stretches of frost, built almost entirely on trust and reciprocity rather than money. Imagine for a moment Harriet, whom we spent considerable time with earlier tonight, sitting alone in her own gradually emptying parlour, receiving an unannounced knock at her door from a neighbour she barely knew well, carrying a small covered dish of something warm simply because word had quietly travelled that the widow 2 doors down was struggling more than most that particular week. No grand gesture, no formal charity paperwork to fill out, no stigma attached the way a workhouse admission carried with it. Just one woman noticing another woman's hardship and responding to it directly, the way countless unrecorded exchanges like this one almost certainly happened on freezing streets across the entire country, leaving no trace in any official ledger, no mention in any surviving letter, simply because nobody involved thought to consider it noteworthy enough to write down. During the very worst weeks, households sometimes doubled up entirely, one family moving in with another, simply to share a single fire rather than maintaining 2 half-heated homes across the same freezing month. It was not always a comfortable arrangement, crowded rooms and stretched patients being what they are, but it kept more people warm on less fuel than either household could have managed separately. A practical calculation that mattered considerably more than privacy or comfort, once the temperature dropped low enough. Washing day of all things became an unlikely source of shared warmth too, since heating enough water for a household's laundry required a substantial fire regardless, and more than one household found practical reasons to combine their washing with a neighbour's on the coldest days, sharing both the fuel cost and the brief, steamy warmth of a kitchen suddenly full of boiling water and drying linen. Formal charity existed alongside all of this informal neighbourly support too, though it looked rather different from the emergency relief funds we discussed a little earlier tonight. Organisations specifically built around supporting women in domestic service, for instance, offered modest financial rewards and assistance to servants who had spent years in loyal, reliable employment, a small acknowledgement, however imperfect, of exactly the kind of exhausting invisible labour Alice herself performed every single winter morning. A servant who managed to hold the same difficult position for many consecutive years through winters, exactly like the one we spent an entire section examining together, might eventually receive a modest sum from one of these societies, a small formal recognition of loyalty that, while nowhere near adequate compensation for the actual labour involved, at least acknowledged that her years of frozen mornings had been noticed by somebody somewhere. These societies could not solve poverty on any grand scale, and they certainly could not undo the deeper structural problems we have spent this whole evening examining together. But for one particular servant in one particular winter, that small assistance might have meant the difference between managing through to spring and falling through every safety net society had otherwise left unbuilt. There is something worth sitting with here. I think something that quietly pushes back against the picture Victorian respectability liked to present of itself. Official society insisted so firmly on individual reputation, individual self-reliance, individual respectability, the very forces that left women like Harriet so isolated and so limited in her options, that left a governess treated as neither family nor servant, that left a widow choosing between her coal bin and her good name. And yet underneath that official picture an entirely different, considerably kinder system was operating the whole time, women quietly supporting other women, sharing warmth and labour and knowledge in ways that never once needed official permission or approval to exist. I find that particular contradiction rather moving honestly. The formal rules of Victorian society often failed these women badly, sometimes deliberately, sometimes simply through indifference. The informal, unofficial kindness they extended to each other day after day, winter after winter, seems to have carried an enormous amount of the actual weight that formal society quietly refused to shoulder itself. If you ask me which version of Victorian England actually deserves to be remembered more clearly, the rigid, judgmental official rulebook, or the quiet, practical kindness women extended to each other, despite that rulebook, I know exactly which one I would choose. Sewing circles and knitting groups served a similarly practical, quietly economical purpose too. Gathering several women together around a single fire and a single set of candles, rather than each burning fuel separately in her own cold room. Officially, these gatherings existed for company, for conversation, for the shared work of mending and making clothing for the coming season. Unofficially, and perhaps just as importantly, they were also a remarkably efficient way to stretch a household's limited coal and candle budget considerably further than it would have lasted otherwise one fire warming 5 women instead of 5 separate fires, each straining to warm one. There is something rather lovely, I think, about picturing a small circle of women, needles clicking quietly, gossip and gentle laughter, drifting around a single shared fire, each of them there partly for company and partly without ever quite saying so out loud, because it made surviving the week's coal allowance considerably easier to manage. So if you take nothing else away from this particular chapter of our story tonight, I hope it is this. Survival for these women was never really the solitary individual triumph we sometimes picture when we imagine history's hardest moments. It was banked ash keeping a fire alive through the night. It was a warmed brick passed from the same fire that cooked dinner. It was a shared scuttle of coal offered quietly without being asked. It was a small covered dish left at a struggling neighbour's door. It was neighbours' sisters in circumstance, if not in blood, finding their way through an impossible season together, one small practical kindness at a time, largely unrecorded, entirely unglamorous, and in its own quiet way considerably braver than most of the dramatic stories history usually chooses to remember instead. But knowing all of this, the sheer resourcefulness, the quiet community, the small clever tricks passed from hand to hand raises an honest question worth asking before we go any further tonight. If women were this capable, this resilient, this remarkably good at solving impossible problems with almost nothing to work with, why does popular memory still so often picture them as passive fragile, simply waiting for rescue that never quite arrived? That particular misconception, and a few others just as stubborn, deserve some honest correcting, and that is exactly where we need to turn next. Let's answer that question honestly, because I think popular memory has actually gotten quite a lot about this era wrong, and a few of those particular mistakes deserve to be corrected properly before we close out tonight's story. The first misconception is probably the easiest one to spot once you know to look for it. Open almost any period drama set in Victorian England, and you will likely see roaring fireplaces glowing warmly in every single room. A character happens to walk through soft golden light spilling across beautifully decorated interiors regardless of the season extras, strolling comfortably through hallways in nothing heavier than a light shawl. It looks wonderful on camera. It also has almost nothing to do with what we've spent this entire evening actually learning together. One fire, one room, a household counting every single lump of coal like it might be their last. That particular fantasy of universal effortless warmth, says considerably more about what modern audiences find visually appealing and what a film budget can actually afford to heat on set than it does about anything these women actually experienced. But there is a second, quieter misconception buried underneath that first one, and I think it might actually matter more. We tend to picture the women we have spent tonight getting to know Eliza Alice Harriet, the two women sheltering inside their hollow tree as fundamentally isolated figures, small solitary silhouettes fighting an enormous winter entirely alone. And in one very specific sense that picture is accurate. Each of them lacked a husband, a father, a brother, the particular kind of protection Victorian society insisted a respectable woman needed close at hand. But as we discovered a moment ago, that same word alone hid an entire hidden network of neighbours, shared coal scuttles and quiet, unofficial kindness running underneath it the whole time. Alone did not mean unsupported. It meant more precisely without a man's income or authority standing between her and the world, which in Victorian England specifically turned out to be an entirely different kind of vulnerable than simple physical isolation. And that particular distinction becomes considerably clearer once you step outside England entirely and look at a very different group of women fighting a very different kind of winter on the opposite side of the same ocean during almost exactly the same decades. Picture the American Great Plains during this same general period stretching across what we now call Nebraska, the Dakotas, Kansas, and Montana. Families claiming land under the Homestead Act were required to live on and work their own plot for 5 straight years, and those plots by law sat spread across the landscape with real distance, built directly into the arrangement, often half a mile apart at the very closest, frequently considerably further than that. Towns where they existed at all might sit 10 or 20 miles from a given farm, a genuine journey, rather than a short walk down a city street. If a British woman's isolation was social, hidden inside a crowded city that simply refused to see her properly, an American frontier woman's isolation was almost the exact opposite. It was geographic, physical, measured in miles rather than manners. The houses themselves tell a rather different story too, and I think this particular detail surprises people almost every time I mention it. With very few trees available across most of the open prairie, settlers often built their homes from sod, instead thick bricks cut directly from the earth itself and stacked into walls that could run 2 or 3 feet deep. Compare that for a moment to the thin single-layer brick walls we spent an entire section examining earlier tonight, walls that let the cold press straight through with almost nothing standing in its way. A soddy, as these little prairie homes were affectionately called, actually provided considerably better insulation than most Victorian housing back in England, ironic as that sounds for a house built quite literally out of dirt. The trade-off, of course, was everything else. Dim, near constant darkness inside, since only a single small window and doorway let in any real light at all. Mud dripping steadily through the roof during a thaw, falling directly onto beds, onto food, onto whatever a family happened to be doing at the time. Insects, and the occasional unwelcome snake finding their way in through the walls, close enough that more than one pioneer family kept a stick or a hoe within easy reach beside the bed simply as a matter of routine precaution. Warmer, in other words, did not mean easier. And then winter arrived on the prairie, and it arrived with a particular kind of violence. British women, whatever else they endured, rarely had to face in quite the same form. Blizzards on the open plains could appear with almost no warning at all. Temperatures plunging dramatically within a matter of hours, visibility dropping to nothing in blinding gale-driven snow that could disorient even someone standing only a few steps from their own front door. One particular storm remembered afterwards simply as the blizzard of 1888 struck with such sudden deceptive force that it caught children and their teachers away from home entirely, many of them still at schoolhouses scattered across the open prairie, when the temperature and the snow arrived together all at once with almost no warning. I want to share something with you that a woman named Ruth wrote many decades later, recalling that exact storm from her own childhood. She'd been caught away from home at school when it hit the sky darkening and the temperature collapsing so quickly that teachers across the region had almost no time at all to decide whether to keep children sheltered where they were or attempt the dangerous walk home before conditions grew any worse. Her own house had run out of fuel except for cornstalks, so she and her family made their way instead to their nearest neighbour, a widow living close by. That widow, it turned out, had run out of fuel entirely as well, and the two households ended up burning old chairs simply to survive the night together until the storm finally passed. Ruth, writing as an elderly woman looking back on that same night, still remembered exactly how relieved her own mother had been once the entire family finally made it home safely, and she noted with quiet, sober honesty that many teachers and children across that same storm did not survive it at all. Can you hear how familiar that particular story sounds even from an entire ocean away? A widow, a dwindling fuel supply, a neighbour showing up in genuine crisis, and the two of them figuring out together how to survive a night that neither one could have survived completely alone. The details are different: sod instead of brick cornstalks instead of coal, an open empty prairie instead of a crowded London street. But the underlying pattern, women reaching toward each other, the moment individual resources ran out, looks remarkably, almost startlingly similar on both sides of the Atlantic. Here is something else worth knowing, something that quietly challenges another assumption many of us carry about this era without ever fully examining it. Historians studying land records across several Great Plains states now estimate that something close to 1 in every 5 homestead claims belong to a single woman filing entirely on her own, with no husband's name attached to the paperwork at all. That figure alone tends to surprise people, since our collective mental image of the American frontier so rarely includes women as independent claimants in their own right, standing at a land office signing their own name to their own future. One of the very first successful claims in Nebraska Territory, in fact, belonged to a widow named Mary Meyer, a German immigrant who staked her land only days after the very first claim office opened, right beside a plot claimed by a man history remembers rather more prominently as the first official homesteader in the entire territory. Mary proved up her farm within the required 5 years, meeting every demand the law placed on her exactly as any male claimant would have had to, and she never remarried at all. For more than a century afterward, her name sat quietly forgotten in county records, overshadowed by her more famous neighbour, until historians finally rediscovered her story only within the last dozen years or so. It took the wider world roughly 150 years to properly notice a woman who had spent her entire adult life proving quite literally in writing that she needed nobody's permission to build a life on land legally unambiguously her own. And that particular fact points toward one of the more fascinating differences between these two versions of the same general struggle. Frontier necessity, brutal as it clearly was, occasionally granted American women a kind of practical authority that Victorian British propriety almost never allowed. A widow on the Great Plains typically took direct control of the entire farm herself, making real decisions about crops, animals, and money, because the sheer physical demands of survival left absolutely no room for the polite fiction that a woman could not or should not manage such things herself. Back east, and even more so across the Atlantic in England, a widowed farm would typically pass instead to a son, a brother, or some other male relation the moment the law and custom allowed it, regardless of how capable the widow herself might actually be at running it. The prairie simply could not afford that particular luxury of politeness. If the woman standing in the field did not know how to plant the wheat, nobody else within 20 miles was necessarily coming to do it for her. Compare that directly to Harriet, whom we spent considerable time with earlier tonight, forced into an extremely narrow set of socially acceptable choices, specifically because Victorian respectability insisted a genteel woman simply must not manage money, trade, or property the way a man would. The American frontier, in its own harsh, unglamorous way, sometimes handed women more genuine independence, precisely because pretending otherwise would have gotten everyone killed considerably faster. There is something almost bracingly honest about that particular trade-off when you sit with it properly. Necessity, it turns out, can occasionally dismantle a prejudice considerably faster than any amount of polite argument ever could. I do not think that makes frontier life easier, to be perfectly clear. If anything, the isolation these women face, particularly during a true prairie blizzard, could be even more immediately dangerous than anything we have discussed happening inside Victorian London. There was no neighbour a few streets away to knock on in a genuine emergency, no charitable soup kitchen opening its doors down the road. There was only whoever happened to live within walking distance, and sometimes during the worst storms not even that. Isolation researchers studying this exact period have documented a real recognised psychological toll it took on many women, specifically a condition contemporaries described somewhat unkindly as prairie madness, brought on by exactly the kind of crushing, endless isolation we're describing right now. Months at a stretch, with barely another adult face to speak to the flat, silent horizon, stretching in every direction with nothing to interrupt it. Some women, according to surviving letters and diaries from the period, kept caged birds inside their tiny sod homes for no practical reason at all beyond simple companionship, a small singing reminder that they were not, despite every appearance, otherwise entirely cut off from all living company. Can I ask you something, honestly? If you had to choose between these two particular versions of hardship, a crowded city that watched you constantly but refused to truly help you, or an empty open landscape that left you almost entirely alone but occasionally granted you real independence in exchange, which one do you think you would have found harder to survive? I have turned that particular question over in my own mind more than once while researching tonight's story, and honestly I still do not have a confident answer for you. What both of these stories share, I think, matters considerably more than where they differ. Whether surrounded by millions of indifferent strangers in London, or separated by miles of empty frozen prairie in Nebraska, women facing an impossible winter kept finding their way back to each other, whenever and however that was actually possible. A shared scuttle of coal, a shared fire built from broken furniture. A widow's door knocked on by strangers in genuine need, opened without a single moment's hesitation. That particular instinct reaching toward another person the instant your own resources finally ran out seems to cross oceans, cultures, and completely different landscapes without losing any of its essential shape. It makes me wonder, honestly, whether that instinct says something rather hopeful about people in general, regardless of which particular century or continent happens to be testing them at the time. So here we are near the very end of our story tonight, having spent this entire evening inside one particular winter in one particular corner of the world, only to discover almost by accident that the exact same quiet courage was playing out an entire ocean away at nearly the exact same time. But everything we have learned about Eliza, about Alice, about Harriet, about the two women who turned a hollow tree into something resembling a home, deserves one final proper resting place. What actually became of women like them? what their winter ultimately meant, not just for the season they were fighting to survive, but for everything that came afterward. And that closing chapter, the one that finally brings all of these threads together, is exactly where we need to go now. Let's go back one final time to that small cold room where we first met Eliza tonight, because I think she deserves a proper ending before we let her go. We never learn with any real certainty exactly what became of her, once that particular winter finally released its grip on London. History rarely kept careful records of women exactly like her, women without title, without fortune, without a single dramatic headline attached to their name. There was no marriage announcement waiting to close out her story neatly, no obituary detailing a life well lived, no portrait hanging in any gallery, no letter preserved in any archive, nothing at all beyond the simple quiet fact that she existed, and that she fought morning after morning to keep existing through a season that seemed determined to test exactly how long she could hold on. But here is what we do know with complete confidence, because we watched it happen with our own eyes at the very start of tonight's story. On one particular freezing morning, in one of the harshest winters her country had ever recorded, a woman with nobody left to rely on knelt down on a floor cold enough to hurt and simply refused to give up on a single stubborn spark. She built her fire. She got dressed in layer after careful layer. She walked out into a frozen city and did whatever that day required of her. And then, as far as anything in the historical record can tell us, she woke up the next morning and did it all over again, and then again after that, through weeks that must have felt by the middle of February almost endless. That more than any grand conclusion I could offer you is really the whole story. Not a single triumphant moment, no dramatic rescue arriving in the final act to tie everything together neatly. 1,000 small, unglamorous ones instead, repeated with a kind of quiet stubbornness that never once asked for applause, because nobody watching would have thought to offer any. If Eliza is still out there somewhere, in whatever way memory allows a person to remain, I hope she knows that someone all these years later finally noticed. Alice, the young housemaid, whose mornings began even earlier and colder than the Eliza's own, almost certainly kept climbing those same servant stairs for years, afterward her hands growing more practiced, if never quite less chapped with every passing winter. Perhaps she eventually rose to housekeeper herself, finally warm enough, finally senior enough to send some other exhausted young girl up those same stairs in her place, teaching her in turn the same trick of banking a fire that would have saved Eliza so much trouble on that very first morning we spent together tonight. Perhaps she married eventually a footman from a neighbouring household, or a tradesman she met on one of her rare afternoons off, and left service behind entirely for a small household of her own to manage on her own terms for once. Or perhaps she simply kept doing exactly what she had always done, invisible, essential, and almost entirely unrecorded, the way so much of the labour that built Victorian comfort quietly was decade after decade without a single line of gratitude ever making it into any surviving record. Either way, the fires she built with her own frozen hands warmed rooms she was rarely permitted to sit in herself for as long as her strength allowed it, and that fact alone deserves to be remembered properly even this many generations later. Harriet, doing her careful arithmetic by candlelight, may have found her way towards something more stable, eventually a distant relation willing to help a small annuity, finally arriving through the settlement of her husband's affairs, perhaps even a companion position that treated her with more genuine kindness than most such arrangements typically offered. Or she may not have. Genteel poverty rarely announced its final outcome with any particular drama. It simply continued quietly for as long as it needed to, sometimes easing with time, sometimes not, the coal bin refilling some winters and emptying dangerously in others, an entire life measured out in exactly the kind of careful, unglamorous survival we have spent this whole evening learning to recognize and respect. If she's remembered at all today, it is likely only as a name in a census record. A widow occupation, blank age uncertain, the kind of quiet historical footnote that so easily gets overlooked entirely unless someone eventually decides her story is worth telling properly. And the two women who turned a hollow dying tree into something resembling a home, arranging their borrowed chairs and their careful shawls night after night against a cold that could have killed either one of them at any moment, we simply do not know what became of them at all. Their names never made it into the record that preserved their story. Only their resourcefulness did a single small paragraph tucked inside an old newspaper account nearly lost entirely to time before it found its way into tonight's story instead. I think about that particular gap more than I probably should, honestly. Two women clever enough, brave enough, and determined enough to survive an entire London winter inside a tree, and history could not even be bothered to remember their names. It feels like exactly the kind of quiet injustice this whole story has been circling around from the very first moment we sat down together tonight. Winters like the one we spent this entire evening exploring together did leave a mark on the wider world eventually, even if that change came slowly and unevenly, and considerably later than any of the women we met tonight could have benefited from personally. In the years that followed, growing public awareness of exactly how devastating a harsh winter could be for the poorest households helped fuel a broader conversation about poverty housing and public welfare that would eventually reshape English social policy across the following decades. None of that came quickly enough to help Eliza or Alice, or Harriet or the two women in their hollow tree. Change of that particular kind almost never arrives quickly enough for the people actually living through the crisis that eventually inspires it. It rarely does even now in our own far more comfortable century. But their winter, and countless winters exactly like it, quietly became part of the evidence, the accumulated, unglamorous weight of ordinary suffering that eventually helped convince a slow-moving society that something needed to change one small, unrecorded life at a time. Here is what I want you to carry with you now that we've reached the end of this particular winter together. The women we spent tonight getting to know were never simply victims of their circumstances, however brutal those circumstances clearly were. They were problem solvers. They were quiet experts in exactly the kind of practical, unglamorous survival that never earns a statue or a headline, but that kept entire households, entire streets, entire neighborhoods functioning through a season determined to test every single one of them at once. Every 20 minutes spent coaxing a dead fire back to life. Every shared scuttle of coal offered without ceremony. Every hollow tree turned carefully into shelter. Every widow doing impossible arithmetic by candlelight rather than simply giving up on the numbers entirely. All of it was courage, even though almost none of it looked like courage the way we usually picture the word dramatic, loud, and instantly recognizable the moment it happens. And here is something worth sitting with as we close this particular chapter. The specific dangers we spent tonight exploring together uninsulated homes, fuel too expensive for the families who needed it. Most, women left with painfully few respectable paths toward genuine financial independence, have not entirely vanished from the world even now more than a century later. Households today still face impossible choices between heating and eating during the hardest months of winter. Widows and single women still navigate financial systems that were never really designed with their particular circumstances in mind. We have better coats now, better insulation, better medicine, and for that we should be considerably more grateful than most of us probably are on an ordinary Tuesday. But the underlying story, resourceful people, finding a way to survive a world that was not always built with their survival in mind, is not nearly as far behind us as the crinolines and coal scuttles might suggest. I think that is exactly why stories like Eliza's still matter honestly all these years later. Not because her winter was uniquely tragic, though it certainly was hard enough to earn that description, but because the particular kind of quiet, patient, unglamorous courage she showed, getting up one more time, building one more fire, refusing to let an impossible season defeat her completely, is not actually locked away in the past at all. It is available to any of us on any difficult morning whenever we happen to need it. I find something rather comforting in that thought, if I am being completely honest with you. History is not only a record of what happened to people very different from ourselves. Sometimes, if you look closely enough, it is also a rather useful instruction manual for exactly the kind of quiet resilience we might need ourselves one day, whether the challenge in front of us involves a dying fire or something else entirely, some difficulty of our own a century from now might feel just as distant and strange to a future audience as Eliza's frozen morning feels to us tonight. So before we let this particular winter finally rest, I want to say a genuine thank you for spending this time with me tonight, for staying through every cold morning, every hard truth, every small hard-won moment of warmth we found together along the way. Telling a story like this one properly takes hours of sitting with old records, old newspapers, old accounts written by people who never imagined anyone would still be reading their words more than a century later. I will admit somewhere around the fourth or fifth account of somebody's dress catching fire, I did seriously consider writing a much gentler story about, say, Victorian flower arranging instead. But then I kept finding women like Eliza and Alice and Harriet tucked away in old records nobody had bothered to look through properly in decades, and I could not quite bring myself to leave them there unnoticed any longer. Stories like this one only really work because someone on the other end is willing to sit quietly and actually listen to them patiently all the way through to the very end, and I am grateful you were that someone tonight, whatever time it happens to be, wherever you are, whatever kind of day brought you here to spend this particular evening with women who lived and struggled so long before either of us were born. If any part of Eliza's story, or Alice's, or Harriet's, or the two women who made a home inside a dying tree stayed with you the way it stayed with me while I was putting all of this together, I would love to hear about it. Leave a comment and tell me which part of tonight's journey affected you the most, or which one of these women you found yourself thinking about longest after we moved on to the next. Tell me too if you have ever built your own version of that morning fire, whatever form it happened to take in your own life, some small unglamorous act of persistence nobody else fully noticed at the time. I look through every single comment, and honestly, some of the very best parts of putting these stories together come from hearing which pieces actually landed with you. And if you have not already, a like and a subscribe truly helps stories exactly like this find their way to more people who might need a little company and a little history on a quiet night just like this one. There are more winters waiting to be told properly. More women whose quiet courage never quite made it into the history books the way it deserved to. There are other rooms, other fires, other quiet, unglamorous acts of survival, scattered all across history, simply waiting for someone to slow down long enough to notice them properly. If tonight's story is the kind of company you are hoping for, I would love for you to come back and sit with me again for the next one, whenever that particular evening happens to find you. Until then, let the fire in this story be the last thing warming the room tonight. Let Eliza's small, hard-won victory over that dying flame be the last image you carry with you as your own eyes grow heavy. Picture her shoulders finally dropping just slightly the way anyone's do when a small, difficult battle has just been won, and let that same quiet relief settle over you now wherever you happen to be listening from. Close your eyes, let the cold of Eliza's world fade quietly behind you, and rest easy, knowing that whatever winter you happen to be facing in your own life right now, whatever quiet, unglamorous battle you're fighting that nobody else has fully noticed, yet you are in your own way every bit as capable of finding your way through it as she was. She did not have warmth waiting for her every single morning. She simply refused to stop building it herself, one small spark at a time for as long as the season demanded it of her. Sleep well tonight, and thank you truly for spending it here with me.